Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of young people was having fun, riding on a boat. It seemed like a typical youthful pastime, but a few minutes later, at 2:20 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The boat at full speed crashed into a bridge. This accident took the life of a young girl and forever changed the destinies of the other participants of that fatal trip. The name of the deceased was Mallory Beach. She was born on April 18, 1999, in the small town of Walterboro, South Carolina, USA. The girl had two older sisters, Morgan and Savannah. 19-year-old Mallory was a graduate of Wade Hampton High School and had just started at the University of South Carolina. Alongside her studies, she worked at a clothing boutique in Beaufort. She had numerous plans for the future, dreaming of becoming an interior designer. Mallory also had a great love for animals. She had her own dogs and even dedicated her free time to volunteering at an animal shelter. She was a sunshine girl, someone you wanted to be friends with and spend time with. According to her family and friends, Mallory was very sociable, kind, and sincere. She was loved by everyone around her. The girl had many friends with whom she enjoyed spending time. At the time of the tragedy, Mallory was dating a guy named Anthony Cook. The couple socialized with 20-year-old Paul Murdaugh, a representative of a very wealthy and influential family in the area. But more on that later. Pay attention to the age of the group. The youngest was only 19 and the oldest was 20. Essentially, they were all still children, despite their legal status as adults. At that age, one seeks new experiences, intense feelings, feeling like the whole world belongs to them. On February 23, 2019, Paul Murdaugh invited friends to a party at his parents' house. Mallory, Anthony, Connor with his girlfriend Mel, and Paul's friend Morgan set off there on a boat owned by the Murdaugh family. It was a 5-meter sea hunting boat, not a cheap toy. On the way, the young people started drinking alcoholic beverages, despite being underage. None of them had the right to buy or consume alcohol, but as I mentioned earlier, at that age, the law often seems distant and unimportant. Well, as the youth sailed to their destination, they had no idea how this party would end. The boat was being steered by intoxicated Paul, while the rest were having a good time, drinking beer and other drinks. It seemed like a great time awaited them ahead. But as they say, man proposes, God disposes. And soon all plans and hopes were dashed by one fatal moment. They could have reached their destination by car, but for some reason the friends decided to go by boat. Why, you may ask? It's quite simple. Paul and the company wanted to drink on the way and avoid the risk of being stopped by the police. It seems logical, but are such risks justified? The merry group arrived at the Murdaugh residence. There they continued the feast, eating oysters, drinking, having fun. It seemed like a typical youth party. But in my opinion, all the fun went downhill when a group of tipsy individuals decided to sail back. And to make matters worse, Paul was once again steering the boat, barely able to stand at that point. Unfortunately, young people often ignore such things, thinking that nothing will happen to them. Oh, if only they knew how it would end. But let's return to the events of that night. On the way back home, Paul decided to dock at the shore and buy more alcohol. Together with Connor, they went to the store, leaving the rest waiting on the boat. The guys were already quite drunk and continued to drink alcohol, while their friends suffered from fatigue and impatience. Everyone wanted to get home quickly and rest. You know, that's the problem with alcohol, it dulls one's sense of reality. A person stops assessing the situation rationally, ignores the needs and safety of those around them. Perhaps Mallory and the company already felt that something was wrong. But who knew that this alarm would turn into a real horror? Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Paul and Connor finally left the bar. They could barely stand on their feet, but managed to make it back to the boat. Paul once again took the helm, and the group set off towards home. At that point, Murdaugh had lost all sense of reality. He began undressing, leaving himself in just his underwear, claiming he was hot. This despite the freezing weather outside. When a person seriously perceives freezing cold as heat, that's a diagnosis. And how, for heaven's sake, was Paul planning to steer the boat in such a state? He couldn't even control himself, let alone a mode of transportation. And we haven't even reached the most terrifying part yet. What happened next surpassed all my boldest expectations. Mallory and Anthony, observing Paul's erratic behavior, moved to the stern, trying to stay away from trouble. But what happened next shocked them even more. Enraged, Paul unexpectedly struck and pushed his girlfriend, which was the last straw. The boat suddenly gained speed, and the situation began to spiral out of control. This is what alcohol does to people, turns them into aggressive, uncontrollable beings. Paul, who was the life of the party just a few hours ago, now posed a real threat to those around him. And the worst part was that he continued to steer the boat, endangering the lives of everyone on board. At a frantic speed, the boat began to sway from side to side. The friends struggled to stay on their feet, grabbing onto anything they could. Mallory and Anthony clung to each other, hoping that this horror would soon end. But the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed and everything around froze. The boat at full speed crashed into the bridge, tossing passengers around like rag dolls. The impact was so strong that Mallory couldn't hold on and was thrown overboard, disappearing into the dark waters of the river. The rest were trapped on the battered boat, stuck between the pilings. I saw photos from the accident scene. It was a horrifying sight. It's hard to imagine anyone surviving such a collision, and as painful as it is to say, Mallory's chances were slim. Being in icy water in February, especially after such an impact, it was practically a death sentence. Meanwhile, the boat began to rapidly sink. Panicked, the friends jumped into the river, trying to save themselves and find Mallory. They called out her name, shone flashlights, but it was all in vain. Darkness and cold thwarted all their efforts. And what about our ill-fated captain? Instead of helping search for Mallory, Paul just lay in the mud under the bridge, not even attempting to get up. The cold and shock had rendered him completely helpless. Fortunately, Connor kept a clear head and called for help. At 2:26 a.m., he dialed 911 and reported the accident. Meanwhile, Anthony continued his desperate search for Mallory, despite his own exhaustion and hypothermia. And Morgan, Paul's friend, lay on the shore with a head injury, bleeding. And all because of what? Because of the irresponsibility and recklessness of one person who decided that revelry was more important than safety. This story is a vivid example of how easily one can ruin not only their own life, but also the lives of those around them. What happened next was so extraordinary that I couldn't believe my ears. While Anthony continued his desperate attempts to find Mallory in the night darkness, Connor and Melly decided to climb up to the bridge for a better view. Unfortunately, even that vantage point didn't help. The river seemed to have swallowed the girl, leaving no trace. Imagine this scene: a foolish night, bone-chilling cold, and utter helplessness. You call for help, but all around you is water and darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, your friend fights for every breath, and you can do nothing. It's a real nightmare that, unfortunately, became a reality for Mallory's company. Meanwhile, Paul, who'd finally come to his senses, crawled back onto the battered boat. It seemed like the perfect time to repent and put all efforts into rescuing Mallory. But no, our hero decided that his place was next to his injured girlfriend. Strange priorities, wouldn't you say? Minutes after the call, rescuers and police arrived at the scene. They immediately plunged into the icy water, hoping to find Mallory. Meanwhile, medics provided assistance to Morgan, who had suffered a severe blow. It seemed like everyone understood the criticality of the situation. Everyone except Paul. You won't believe it, but this guy continued to sit on the remnants of the boat in just his underwear, kicking his legs and talking on the phone. He didn't even make an effort to help the rescuers, let alone focus on the situation. Paul was in his own world, detached from reality. But what impressed me the most was what happened next. Upon reaching the shore, Paul began to smile and behave as if nothing had happened. No concern, no remorse, no attempt to join the search efforts. He just stood aside while his friends ran around, barely holding back tears and pleading with the river to return Mallory. While passions raged on the shore, rescuers continued to systematically search the river. All available boats and vessels joined the search. People on the boats peered into the water, hoping to spot any trace of the missing girl. But with each passing minute, hope dwindled like the last ray of light in the pitch-black darkness. Rescuers decided to transport Mallory's friends to the hospital. They feared for their health after all. Being in icy water could have serious consequences. Anthony was the last to agree to go. Overwhelmed by despair, exhausted and frozen, he never gave up his attempts to find his beloved. Too much time had passed, the water was too cold. But to stop the search meant to face the worst, so the rescuers continued their work, praying for a miracle. Did a miracle happen? When you find out what happened next, your heart will beat like crazy. While Mallory's friends were recovering in the hospital after the boat tragedy, the police paid them a visit. It seemed like the perfect time for a thorough interrogation to uncover all the circumstances of that fateful night. But it wasn't that simple. The Murdaugh family, using their influence, decided to intervene in the process. The Murdaugh dynasty is not just wealthy and successful people. They are a whole system that has controlled the legal sphere of the district for decades. Imagine this: since 1920, someone from this family has consistently held the position of chief prosecutor. They had their own law firm, connections in all levels of power. Essentially, the law was just a convenient tool for them to achieve their goals. And when their son Paul found himself at the center of a scandal, the Murdaughs decided to use all their arsenal. The boy's father and grandfather personally rushed to the hospital to protect him from the police. They pressured the cops, threatened, and used their status. The main task was to prevent Paul from being taken into custody and charged. Meanwhile, extensive searches for Mallory continued. Divers and even helicopters were involved in the rescue operation. Every inch of the river was combed in hopes of finding the girl alive. But with each passing hour, this hope dwindled, giving way to the bitter realization of reality. Anthony, barely recovered from the hospital, once again plunged into the search. He couldn't come to terms with the thought that he might never see his beloved again. Day after day, the young man tirelessly searched the shores, plunged into the icy water, begged the river to return Mallory. It seemed he was willing to do anything just to find out the truth. Only on March 3, what everyone secretly feared but expected happened. Volunteers searching the river came across the body. It was wedged between logs about 5 miles from the accident site. The current had carried the deceased so far from the scene of the tragedy, as if wanting to forever hide the traces of the crime. The body belonged to Mallory Beach, a beautiful young girl who had her whole life ahead of her. A girl whose only fault was being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. And now she was found cold, motionless, forever frozen in time and space. Mallory was simply a beauty. Long dark hair, radiant eyes, a charming smile. She exuded sincerity and kindness, qualities so rarely encountered in the modern world. And realizing that this girl would never smile again, never hug her loved ones, never fulfill her dreams, it simply breaks the heart. But finding Mallory's body was just the beginning. Now the family had to endure the worst say goodbye and bury her. All the pain, all the sorrow, all the horror of the situation had to culminate in this tragic finale. And although the official cause of death had not been announced yet, it was evident to everyone. Mallory had become a victim of human irresponsibility and cruelty. A victim of a system that allows the wealthy to evade punishment. A victim of the world's indifference to the lives of ordinary people. Will the Beach family be able to prove Paul's guilt and seek justice? The following events were so tense that I was literally on the edge of my seat. When Mallory's body was retrieved from the water, many still clung to hope that the girl had somehow survived. However, the autopsy results definitively shattered these illusions. The medical examiners determined that the cause of death was drowning and a severe head trauma from being struck by a blunt object. For experienced cops, it's sometimes hard to remain calm when you hear such conclusions. Poor Mallory. She didn't just drown before her death. The girl suffered, felt pain and fear, and all because of someone's senseless prank that turned into a tragedy. The investigation reconstructed the likely chain of events that night. After the boat collided with a bridge support, Mallory struck her head against a hard object, likely the boat's side or a pylon. The powerful impact knocked her unconscious and she fell overboard. In her unconscious state, she sank and drowned. The strong current then carried her body far from the accident site. Around 500 people came to bury Mallory, relatives, friends, acquaintances, just caring individuals. Each brought flowers and tears, each remembered her kindly. On this day, grief united very different people. They stood silently over the casket, unrestrained in their emotions, because everyone understood a great injustice had occurred. When you see such a crowd at the funeral of a young girl, you can't help but wonder what a vibrant and full life she must have lived. How many hearts she touched, how much good she managed to do. And the realization that this life was cut short so early and so tragically becomes chilling. Of course, no one had any doubts about who bore responsibility for Mallory's death. Paul's intoxicated state, his reckless behavior at the helm, everything pointed to this accident being no coincidence. It was a direct consequence of criminal negligence and disregard for safety rules. It would seem the case could be closed and the guilty party put behind bars. But it's not so simple when it comes to the rich and influential. The Murdaugh family had no intention of giving up their position so easily. They were prepared to do anything to cover for Paul and bury this story. Money and connections often allow people to avoid accountability, especially in small towns like this built on cronyism and a circle of complicity. The Murdaughs understood this well, so they immediately set their resources in motion, putting pressure on the police, bribing witnesses, hiring the best lawyers, and the first results of their work didn't take long. The police suddenly started claiming it was unknown who was at the helm during the accident. That witness testimonies were unreliable because everyone was intoxicated, though this is an outright manipulation because Mallory's friends unanimously stated that Paul was driving the boat. Meanwhile, young Murdaugh himself pretended to have amnesia. claiming he didn't remember how it all went down, that someone else may have been steering the boat, even though the forensics showed his blood alcohol level was 3 times over the limit. In other words, there could be no question of Paul's lucidity or responsibility. There you have it, an example of how the system works when big money gets involved. No matter the evidence against Paul, no matter the testimonies, it's nothing compared to the influence of his family. The police, who should uphold the law, side with the criminal. Witnesses suddenly forget important details, and the deceased is left as just another loud headline in the crime blotter. But does this mean there will be no justice and the guilty will go unpunished? When you see what happens next, you'll be holding your breath in suspense. While the Beach family mourned the loss of Mallory, the investigation continued gathering evidence against Paul Murdaugh. And it has to be said, there was more than enough of it. Judge for yourselves. In the refrigerator on the boat, they found a veritable arsenal of alcoholic beverages from beer to harder stuff. Interesting, and just who are those intended for? Surely not the underage passengers. Finding alcohol on board is already a violation in itself, especially when one of the underage kids is at the helm, as in our case. It's like handing a loaded gun to a child. You never know how such recklessness will end. But the most glaring evidence of Paul's criminal behavior came from the surveillance camera footage. It clearly shows Murdaugh nonchalantly strolling into the 24-hour store and buying alcohol, and after successfully purchasing the booze, he almost dances with glee, as if to say, "Look how cleverly I fooled everyone." It gets even more interesting after that. Literally seconds later, Paul is already loading the purchases into the boat's refrigerator, so he consciously brought alcohol on this ill-fated trip. And this while he himself was planning to be at the helm. No doubts, no hesitation, just a pursuit of adrenaline and fun. There you have a portrait of today's golden youth. They don't give a damn about laws, safety, basic human decency. The main thing is to have a wild time and document it all over social media. Consequences. Who cares about those? Daddy's money will smooth over any problems. That's their philosophy of impunity. The GPS navigator data also proved very useful for the investigation. It showed that around 12:30 a.m., as the party was winding down, Paul and his friends stopped at a bar. Surveillance cameras captured him with Connor at the bar counter. The guys were animatedly discussing something while knocking back hard drinks, and this while Paul was driving the boat himself. He must have thought a couple of glasses was no big deal, that he could handle it. Only he overestimated his abilities, overestimated to the point that it cost a young girl her life. Ultimately, about an hour after visiting the bar, the whole crew gathered back on the boat. The last surveillance camera footage from the dock confirmed this. The friends boarded the boat, Paul started the engine, and they set off into the night darkness, headed straight towards their fatal mistake. Of course, Mallory's relatives had no intention of accepting such a glaring injustice. First, they filed a lawsuit against the store and bar that sold alcohol to the underage Paul, claiming it was their irresponsibility that led to the tragedy. But for some reason, the judge didn't take this argument into account. The suit was dismissed. Once again, the system sided with the powerful elite, so the girl's family decided to come at it from another angle, hold Paul's relatives accountable for allowing him to use someone else's ID to purchase alcohol. And this lawsuit was accepted for consideration. It seems the judge realized the case was gaining notoriety and something had to be done. Because people's patience wears thin when they see the wealthy spitting on the law and common sense. After what happened, I felt like I was transported to another reality. April 18th, 2019 should have been the day Mallory celebrated her 20th birthday. Instead, this date became the day of reckoning for Paul Murdaugh. The young man was hit with 3 very serious charges: operating a boat under the influence, the unintentional homicide of Mallory Beach, and inflicting severe injuries on 2 other passengers, Connor and Morgan. However, Paul somehow did not consider himself guilty. To all the accusations, he calmly responded, "No, it wasn't me." As if to say, so what if I was a little drunk? It happens. Especially since Daddy had already hired him a whole army of lawyers. So the boy was confident that his dad's golden money would get him off scot-free. You know what bothers me most about these spoiled rich kids? Their unshakable belief in their own untouchability. They genuinely believe you can buy your way out of anything: laws, conscience, human lives. And you know they're kind of right. Because as long as money and connections decide everything in our society, there's no justice to be found. And indeed, the terms under which Paul was released on bail were, to put it mildly, bizarre. The kid posted a measly $50,000 despite his family being able to easily afford much more. And that's it, a bon voyage, you can go on partying. Paul was allowed to freely travel the country, hang out at bars, even operate a boat. Yes, you heard that right, a boat. This after his little joyride had already cost someone their life. While intoxicated, no less. Is that not absurd? Honestly, when I hear stuff like that, my hands just drop. They really had to bend the justice system that far for a potential killer to walk away scot-free. And this while all involved, the police, judges, prosecutors, are supposed to uphold the law, not the interests of the wealthy. Though even the circus with the measly bail amount is just the tip of the iceberg. Imagine Paul's mugshot in the database. Usually these photos are taken at the police station when a suspect is officially arrested. The person wears a prison jumpsuit, hands cuffed. But rules are for mere mortals. For some reason, Paul posed for his criminal portrait in the hallway of his own mansion, looking stylish in a plaid shirt. Not once was he handcuffed, made to wear a prison jumpsuit, or spend a night behind bars. Because why would we want to traumatize the golden child, right? But maybe this tragedy at least served as a wake-up call for Paul. Forced him to come to his senses, reevaluate his behavior. Ultimately, own up to his guilt and face the punishment due like a man. Instead of hiding behind the coattails of his influential family. But something tells me that won't happen. The boy is far too accustomed to his untouchable status, and all these court proceedings are just pesky mosquitoes to him. One clap of the hands and poof, problem solved. The events that unfolded next were so shocking that I still cannot come to terms with them. While the public's attention was fixated on the legal wrangling surrounding Paul Murdaugh, something absolutely unexpected occurred. On June 7, 2021, in the midst of the proceedings, Paul and his mother Maggie were found shot dead near the dog kennels on their estate. Yes, you heard that right, shot dead. Remember when I said sometimes fate deals surprises money can't buy? It seems the Murdaugh's time for reckoning had arrived. Someone decided to mete out justice their own way. Or perhaps it was a banal act of revenge, a personal vendetta against the powerful family. The crime scene painted a chilling picture. Paul was shot twice in the chest and head, fired from a non-lethal weapon. The kind that typically doesn't kill but inflicts serious injury. However, at close range to vital organs, such shots can prove fatal. It turns out no amount of money or connections can protect you when someone is truly out for vengeance. And so the question arises, could this murder be linked to the Mallory Beach case? Tied to that question is an intriguing detail. In Paul's pocket, they found his mobile phone positioned quite unusually, as if someone had previously checked its contents, then inconspicuously slipped it back to the owner. As if wanting to hint to investigators, look for answers in the messages. As for Maggie's phone, they initially couldn't find it anywhere. It was only located eventually using the Find My iPhone feature. The mobile was lying somewhere off the estate grounds, and most interesting of all, it had someone else's fingerprints and DNA on it. A slip-up by the killer or a deliberate clue for police? This murder spawned countless questions and conspiracy theories. Why were Paul and his mother specifically targeted? Is it somehow tied to Mallory Beach's death? Or did the Murdaugh clan have other enemies we don't know about? One thing I can say for certain, this story is far from over. The news of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh's deaths shook the entire city. Hell, the whole state was buzzing like a beehive. After all, it's not everyday members of one of the most influential families get gunned down. And the burning question hanging in the air, who did this and why? The police immediately launched an investigation. It was obvious this was a double homicide committed by more than one perpetrator. The weapons testified to that Paul was shot with a non-lethal gun, Maggie with a rifle. Someone came to the Murdaugh estate with deadly intent to kill more than one person. But what really piqued the investigators' interest was that message with the phones. Why leave Paul's mobile in his pocket but discard Maggie's phone elsewhere? Could it be that someone wanted to show detectives, seek the answer in this woman's messages? Perhaps the key to this bloody saga lies within her. And so as the cops were investigating this murder, an unexpected letter arrived. Its sender was the Beach family. Yes, the relatives of that very Mallory who died on the Murdaugh's boat. And here's what they wrote, I quote, "The Beach family extends its deepest and warmest sympathies to the Murdaugh family during this terrible time. Having experienced the devastation of losing their own daughter, Mallory, the Beach family wishes for the Murdaugh family to find some peace after this tragic loss. The Beach family would like the community to know their thoughts and continued prayers are with the Murdaughs. The Beach family sincerely hopes that someone will come forward and cooperate with law enforcement so that the perpetrator of these senseless crimes can be brought to justice." To me, this letter is an overt hint at a connection between the two tragedies. The Beach family is saying, "We know how the Murdaughs suffered after Mallory's death, so now they felt that same pain." However, that's just my speculation. Officially, no link between the murder and the boating accident has been established, at least not yet. All participants of that fateful boat trip that claimed Mallory's life provided fingerprints and DNA samples, and none of them matched what was found at the Murdaugh crime scene. So the revenge theory from Beach's relatives or friends seems to have been dismissed. But something in this story clearly doesn't add up. Too many vague details, dark spots, and ominous coincidences, like their housekeeper's death a few years back, or the strange demise of Stephen Smith, a young man linked to the Murdaugh's eldest son, Buster. The case of Paul Murdaugh and his mother is still under investigation. Relatives are filing lawsuit after lawsuit, while someone is trying to uncover the truth about Mallory Beach's death, the girl this all started with. Of course, this story will be discussed in South Carolina for a long time to come. Mallory and the Murdaughs, the boat and estate with its dog kennels, will be mentioned again and again. Some will speak of conspiracy, others of divine retribution. But what do you think? I'm very curious to know. But I want you to remember the main thing. No matter where you are or who you are, you will answer for everything. Sooner or later, before God and man. And let Mallory's death serve as a reminder to us all. Be careful who you trust. Don't drink and drive. And never, you hear me, never put your whims above other people's lives. And that's all from me. This story is about a young woman named Amanda Albach, who went on a trip with her so-called friends, not even suspecting that this journey would be fatal for her. Amanda was from Brazil, born in 2000. From childhood, she stood out for her beauty and cheerfulness. The girl lived with her mother Silva and 3 siblings. However, when Amanda was only 10 years old, her family was struck by a terrible grief in January 2010. She lost 2 of her older brothers. This tragedy hit the girl's mother hard. Silva fell into depression and for a long time could not fully take care of Amanda. You know, I've seen many similar stories. Losing loved ones, especially at such a young age, can leave a deep mark on a person's soul. Perhaps it was this childhood trauma that played a role in Amanda's future fate. The girl grew up trying to find her place in life, and who knows, maybe she just lacked maternal love and support during that period. But let's not jump to conclusions. Facts are what matter in our work, and the facts are that Amanda went on that fateful trip with people she considered her friends. She trusted them, not even suspecting what they were capable of. And this trust, unfortunately, cost her her life. Of course, it's easy to say now that she should have been more careful, not to trust strangers. But at that moment, Amanda probably just wanted to have some fun, to escape from everyday life. She couldn't have known that these people would turn out to be real monsters. Despite the blow of fate that befell her family, Amanda continued to grow and mature. And so, barely reaching adulthood at the age of 18, she became pregnant. The young woman gave birth to a beautiful, healthy girl. But as often happens at such a young age, motherhood did not prevent Amanda from occasionally having fun with her friends, like an ordinary girl her age. Think about it. A young mother who is not quite an adult herself, responsible for a newborn child. This is an incredible burden that can break anyone. Was Amanda seeking salvation from reality in these entertainments? Was she distracting herself from the daily routine and worries? Amanda had to look for a job. For some time, she worked as a telemarketing operator, not an easy job, believe me. Constant stress, the need to communicate with many people often dissatisfied. Few can withstand such a pace for long. And then, between August and September 2021, when Amanda turned 21, she decided to radically change her life. She quit her job as an operator and, according to her, got a job as a sales manager in several supermarkets. It would seem that this is a wonderful opportunity to start over, to build a better career. But was this the real reason for her dismissal? Was there something else behind this decision? What happened next simply did not fit in my head. Amanda informed her family that due to work, she needed to visit different regions of the state of Santa Catarina. This state, located in southern Brazil, is famous for its picturesque beaches and enchanting islands. It would seem, what could be better than a business trip to such a paradise? But was this the real reason for her trip? Was Amanda using work circumstances as an excuse for something else? Anyway, it was this trip to Santa Catarina that became fateful for the young woman. On November 13, 2021, Amanda left her home and headed to Florianopolis, the state capital. She told her relatives that she was going to her friend Diane's birthday. Some Douglas and his brother Victor were also supposed to be there. Pay attention to these names: Diane, Douglas, Victor. It is these people who will become key figures in the events that follow. But who are they? True friends or casual acquaintances? And was Amanda really going to an ordinary celebration? There are many questions and few answers so far. Florianopolis. Have you ever been to this city? I haven't, but I've heard a lot of good things about it. Beautiful landscapes, wonderful beaches, friendly people. It would seem the perfect place to relax. But as we know, even in the most beautiful places, the most terrible things can happen. What awaited Amanda in Florianopolis? You will be stunned by what happened next in this eerie case. So Amanda informed her family that after celebrating her friend's birthday, she plans to rest a little. This is not surprising because there were long weekends ahead on the occasion of the proclamation of the Republic. What could be better than relaxing on the picturesque beaches of Santa Catarina? On November 13, the young Brazilian woman shared photos and messages on social networks that she was already in place in Santa Catarina. It would seem the usual behavior of a young girl who wants to share her impressions with friends. But is everything as innocent as it seems at first glance? Perhaps these social media posts were a kind of cover, a way to divert suspicion. After all, as it turns out later, not everything was so cloudless on this trip. The next day, November 14th, the company of friends visited a nightclub in one of the tourist areas. Nothing unusual, you might say. Young people having fun, relaxing. But was this trip to the club an ordinary entertainment? Or perhaps it was there that something happened that influenced further events, and now we come to the key point. On November 15, the day Amanda was supposed to return home, around 9 p.m., she sent a voice message to her mother. In it, the girl reported that they were going to Paraná and were looking for a taxi through the app to get straight to the door of the house. Pay attention to the details. Why the sudden trip to Paraná? What made Amanda change her plans so abruptly? And was she really going home as she told her mother? These questions haunt me. A voice message. Amanda's last lifetime trace. Could she have thought then that these would be her last words addressed to her family? They sound so mundane, so familiar. Nothing bodes trouble. But as we know, it was after this message that the real nightmare began. Did Amanda really get into that taxi? And if so, where did it take her? Friends, a very important point, the creation of such content requires a lot of time. And now my channel and I are experiencing not the best financial situation. I will be eternally grateful to you if you become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. And in return, I will be able to personally answer you in the comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become sponsors. I will be eternally grateful to you. Get ready for an unexpected twist that will change everything. After that voice message sent by Amanda on the evening of November 15, her mother Silva patiently waited for her daughter to return home. Minutes slowly turned into hours, but there was no news from Amanda. At first, Silva was not too worried, thinking that her daughter was just delayed at a friend's house. But when the silence dragged on, the mother's heart felt uneasiness. Silva began sending messages to Amanda, hoping to get at least some response. But none of them were read. Messages were sent, but no one viewed them. I've seen this many times in my practice. When a loved one does not get in touch, the first reaction is always disbelief and unwillingness to think about the worst. We grasp at any opportunity to explain the silence with something ordinary familiar. But intuition rarely fails, especially when it comes to loved ones. Feeling growing anxiety, Silva decided to call Amanda. But instead of her daughter's familiar voice, she heard only the answering machine. Again and again, the calls went to voicemail, as if bumping into an invisible wall. This only increased the mother's concern. She assumed that Amanda's phone was turned off or discharged, but it did not make her feel any better. In search of at least some news, Silva began to call Amanda's relatives and friends. Maybe someone heard something from her or knew where she might be. But there was no answer. No one had any information about the girl's whereabouts. Even those friends with whom she celebrated her birthday did not answer calls. A complete lack of information in such situations is always an alarming sign. When a person suddenly disappears from the radar, does not get in touch, and no one has seen or heard from them, this is a reason for serious concern. And Silva's reaction in this case was absolutely justified. You just try to imagine yourself in Silva's place at that moment. Your daughter went on vacation with friends and suddenly disappeared. She does not answer calls and messages. Her phone is turned off. No one from her entourage knows where she is. What would you feel? Fear, confusion, helplessness. These feelings, I'm sure, overwhelmed Silva that night. She did not yet know that her worst nightmare had already begun to come true. She still hoped that it was just some kind of misunderstanding, that Amanda was about to call or write. But this did not happen. Get ready for a real emotional shock. Silva, having tried in vain to contact her daughter, decided to act. Together with other concerned relatives, Silva went to the local police station to report Amanda's disappearance. I want to draw your attention to this point. Many people in similar situations hesitate, do not dare to contact law enforcement. Like, what if the person just got delayed somewhere or decided to disconnect from everyone for a while? But Silver did absolutely the right thing. When it comes to the safety of loved ones, he cannot hesitate. At the police station, Silver told in detail about Amanda's trip to Santa Catarina, about celebrating her friend's birthday, and about the strange voice message she received from her daughter. It was this message that alarmed the relatives the most. Amanda's voice sounded unusual, with notes of anxiety and tension. In addition, strong wind could be heard on the recording, as if the girl was somewhere in the open. You know, over the years of working in the police, I learned to pay attention to such seemingly small things. Sometimes they can point to something very important. A change in intonation, background noise, all this can be the key to unraveling the mystery. And Amanda's relatives did absolutely the right thing by paying attention to these details. Silver's fears began to come true. She was afraid that something bad could have happened to her daughter, that Amanda could be in trouble. And the fact that the girl suddenly disappeared and did not get in touch only confirmed these fears. The fear for a child's life is the worst thing any parent can experience. You are ready for anything, if only to find your child, to make sure that everything is fine with them. And this fear often makes us move forward, not give up, even when it would seem that there is no hope. The police immediately got down to business. They began to collect all available information. Data on Amanda's trip, contacts of her friends, details of the last calls and messages. Every little thing could be crucial in the search for the missing girl. But unfortunately, days passed, and there was still no news from Amanda. It seemed that she had simply dissolved into thin air. No one saw her, no one heard anything. It was a real mystery that became more and more sinister with every hour. What happened to Amanda? Where did she disappear and why? These questions haunted both the girl's family and the police. But they did not even guess what a terrible surprise awaited them ahead. You will not be able to hold back your emotions when you find out what happened next. No calls, no messages, no posts on social networks, absolute silence. As if the girl had simply vanished into thin air. Not having received any news from her daughter, the family officially declared her missing. Amanda's little daughter, who was only 2 years old at the time, suffered the most. The girl was left in the care of her father, while maternal relatives concentrated all their efforts on finding the missing woman. Just imagine this situation. A 2-year-old child who suddenly finds herself without a mother. She is still too small to understand what is happening, but old enough to feel the loss, the absence of the closest person. This is a real tragedy, which unfortunately happens more often than we might think. In parallel with the actions of the family, the police began their own investigation, and the first thing they drew attention to was the 3 people who, according to available information, were the last to see Amanda alive. Diane, Douglas, and Victor was with them that the girl went to celebrate in Santa Catarina. For several days after Amanda's disappearance, investigators tried to contact this trio, but to no avail. It seemed that they too had disappeared, gone underground, and this only increased suspicions about their possible involvement in what happened to Amanda. You know, when potential witnesses or suspects suddenly become unavailable, it always raises suspicions. If a person has nothing to hide, they usually willingly make contact, try to help the investigation. But such disappearances often indicate a desire to avoid responsibility or hide the truth. It took a whole 10 days before the police managed to track down the missing trio. On November 23, Diane, Douglas, and Victor were detained in the city of Canoa's Rio Grande do Sul. This is hundreds of kilometers from the place where Amanda was last seen. The fact that these 3 were so far from Santa Catarina only heightened the suspicions of the investigation. Why run to another state? What made them change their location so abruptly? Were they trying to escape responsibility for what they had done? All these questions demanded answers. The detainees were in for a serious interrogation. Investigators hoped that at least one of them would shed light on what happened to Amanda. After all, more and more time was passing, and the girl's fate was still unknown, and every hour was worth its weight in gold. You will be shocked to the core when you hear what shape this case took. Investigators clearly understood that these 3 were the key to unraveling the mystery of the girl's disappearance. After all, they were the last ones who had contact with her before she disappeared. Every detail, every word they said could be crucial. Interrogations are always a complex and psychologically exhausting process, especially when it comes to possible suspects in a serious crime. Here it is important not only to ask the right questions, but also to be able to read between the lines, to notice inconsistencies and understatements. And believe me, there were plenty of them in this case. Diane was interrogated first, but she could not or did not want to provide any substantial information. The only thing she reported was that her phone broke, so she did not answer calls from Amanda's relatives who tried to contact her after the girl's disappearance. To be honest, this answer immediately aroused suspicion. A broken phone is too convenient and banal an excuse, especially nowadays when almost everyone has a backup means of communication or the ability to quickly fix a breakdown. But at that time, we had no evidence to refute her words. Next in line were Douglas and Victor, and here things got interesting. During the interrogation of the men, investigators noticed significant discrepancies in their testimonies. It seemed that each of them was trying to hide something or distort the facts in their favor. It was obvious that one of them was lying. But who exactly, and most importantly why? These questions haunted the investigators. They understood that the answer to them could be the key to unraveling the mystery of Amanda's disappearance. As cynical as it may sound, often during interrogations, one has to play on human weaknesses. Someone breaks under pressure, someone succumbs to provocations, and someone simply gets tired of lying. And in this case, our weak link turned out to be Douglas Dayan's husband. After several hours of intensive interrogation, Douglas confessed that it was he who killed Amanda and got rid of her body. He claimed that he acted alone and that his wife and brother were not involved in the crime. Based on this testimony, Dayan and Victor were released. It would seem that the case was solved, the criminal was caught. But something about this story didn't sit well with me. Some details didn't add up, some facts contradicted each other. And the deeper we got into the investigation, the more we realized Douglas was lying. And he was not the only one lying. It became increasingly clear that all three were involved in Amanda's disappearance and murder. Douglas, Dayan and Victor. They were clearly hiding something, trying to cover for each other. But what exactly happened on that fatal night? What happened next simply did not fit in my head. During the next interrogation, Douglas began to talk. He spoke in detail, not omitting a single terrible detail, about the last hours of Amanda's life, about what happened after the party to which he, his wife, and brother invited the girl. Over the years, I have heard many confessions. Some of them were too horrific to believe what I heard. But this story, it shocked even me, an experienced detective. I have not yet encountered such cynicism, such cruelty. So according to Douglas, after the party, he took Amanda to the house where he lived with his wife, Dayan. The girl had already stayed here before, during previous visits to Santa Catarina, so she didn't suspect anything bad. But at some point that fateful night, Amanda made a shocking discovery. She realized that her so-called friends were actually drug addicts, and that their house was full of weapons. Shocked by what she saw, the girl took several photos and even managed to share them with some of her other acquaintances. You can only imagine what Amanda felt at that moment. Fear, confusion, distrust. She found herself in a house full of weapons and illegal psychotropic substances, with people she considered her friends. Who would have thought that the desire to have fun and relax would turn into such a nightmare? But Douglas, Dayan, and Victor quickly realized that Amanda had discovered their secret, and this scared them a lot. At first, they were worried that the girl might turn them into the police, because then their criminal business would come to an end. But later, their fears took on an even more sinister character. They began to suspect that Amanda was actually a member of a rival criminal group that had set a trap for them. A crazy idea, isn't it? But for a mind clouded by drugs, this version seemed quite plausible. Criminals often tend to attribute their own motives and intentions to others. They are so immersed in their criminal world that they can no longer think otherwise. And in this case, paranoia played a cruel joke on them. The next few hours after Amanda's terrible discovery, Douglas, Dayan, and Victor spent developing a plan of action. A plan that was terrible and ruthless. They decided to take the girl's life, just because she accidentally found out their secret and photographed the evidence. Just think about it. They were planning a murder, cold-blooded and brazen, and all because of their own paranoia, because of the fear of exposure. No remorse, no pity, no elementary human compassion. Only the desire to get rid of an unwanted witness. This is really scary. When I heard what happened next, I got goosebumps. On November 15, the day Amanda was supposed to return home to her little daughter, she had already been in the captivity of her so-called friends Douglas, his wife Dayan, and brother Victor for more than 8 hours. And these were not just hours of waiting. These were hours of real horror. They began to psychologically torture Amanda, demanding that she confess to belonging to some criminal group. An absurd accusation, considering that the girl had never had any connections with the criminal world. According to the kidnappers themselves, Amanda cried, screamed, begged to be released. She did not understand why these people, whom she considered friends, had suddenly become her executioners. But Douglas, Dayan, and Victor were convinced that the girl posed a threat to them because of the photos she had taken in their home. To gain access to these photos, they resorted to another vile trick. Through threats and intimidation, they forced Amanda to give them the password to her phone, and having gained access, they viewed all the girl's messages and deleted the compromising pictures. They invaded Amanda's privacy, violated her right to privacy, and all in order to hide their own crimes. This is not just mean, it's disgusting and illegal. But the most terrible thing is that even after this, the group was not going to let the girl go alive. They had already decided her fate. After several hours of psychological torture, they forced Amanda to record the same voice message that her mother received, a message designed to divert suspicion and confuse the trail. And then something almost impossible to comprehend happened. They took Amanda to a deserted beach and ordered her to dig a hole that was to become her own grave. The girl cried, screamed, tried to reach the remnants of humanity in her tormentors, but it was all in vain. When the hole was ready, Amanda was pushed into it, and then Douglas fired 2 shots. 2 shots that cut short the life of a young woman, a mother, a daughter. You have no idea how hard it is for me to talk about this. Throughout my career, I've seen a lot of cruelty, but this is something beyond human understanding. How can you cold-bloodedly kill a person you called a friend just yesterday? How can you deprive a little child of a mother? After the murder, the 3 buried Amanda's body, using the same sand that she had dug for her own grave. And then they just left as if nothing had happened. They thought they would escape punishment, but they were wrong. Thanks to the brilliant work of investigators and the testimony of Douglas himself, the police managed to find Amanda's burial place and exhume her body. The examination showed that before her death, the girl had been subjected not only to psychological, but also to physical torture. There were traces of ropes on her body, her mouth was sealed with tape, and her face was disfigured by numerous injuries. Now all 3 killers, Douglas, Dan, and Victor, are in custody. They are facing trial and I hope just punishment. The prosecutor's office intends to seek the highest measure of responsibility for the crimes committed. But whatever punishment they receive, it will not bring Amanda back to life. It will not return the mother to the little girl. The pain of losing Amanda was a real shock for all her loved ones, especially for her mother, Silver. And this is not surprising because, as it turned out, the Albeck family had already faced a similar tragedy before. I talked to the lawyer representing the family's interest, and what he told me cannot leave anyone indifferent. It turns out that Silver had already lost 2 of her children due to violence, and now the 3rd child, beloved daughter Amanda. It's hard to even imagine what this woman had to go through. According to the lawyer, the news of Amanda's death was a real blow for Silver. She was not just killed by grief, she was broken, devastated. The woman had to undergo a course of psychological rehabilitation in order to somehow learn to live with this pain. The only consolation for Silver was her youngest child, the same 2-year-old daughter of Amanda, who will now grow up without a mother. The girl is still too young to realize the full depth of the loss, but I am sure that the love and support of her grandmother will help her cope with this challenge of fate. On December 5, 2021, Amanda was buried in the municipal cemetery near her home. She was accompanied on her final journey by relatives, friends, all those who knew and loved this bright girl. They gathered to pay tribute to her memory and say their last goodbye. The place of Amanda's final rest was strikingly different from that deserted beach where she met her terrible death. There, among the golden sand and the whisper of the waves, her body lay for 18 long days before the truth came to light. 18 days of uncertainty, fear, and pain for those who waited for her at home. I must say that the Brazilian people took Amanda's tragedy very close to heart. People followed every step of the investigation, every new fact that appeared in the press. They empathized and sympathized as if it had happened to someone close to them. And this story shook the whole country also because it reflected the worst human qualities: betrayal, cruelty, soullessness. This horrific event took place on Christmas Eve 2022 in the town of Swilge, located on the outskirts of Liverpool, United Kingdom. The main character of this story is 26-year-old Elle Edwards, a young and attractive girl who worked as a cosmetologist in a local beauty salon and assisted a dermatologist. Elle was a true gem of her town. Her beauty and charm captivated everyone around her, and her kindness and positivity allowed her to find common ground even with the most demanding clients. This girl was not only beautiful on the outside, but also incredibly talented in her field. Thanks to her hard work and determination, she became a first-class specialist in her areas of expertise. Elle always greeted her clients with a sincere smile, radiating joy and optimism. It seemed that everything in this girl's life was going as well as possible. She relentlessly pursued her goals and dreams, building a successful career. But despite her busy schedule, Elle never forgot about her family. She was especially looking forward to Christmas because this year her sister Lucy was supposed to fly in from faraway Dubai. Just imagine how important this reunion with her beloved sister was for Elle. She couldn't wait for her arrival, planning how they would celebrate New Year's and Christmas together. After all, it is in such moments that we feel the value of family bonds and the warmth of loved ones most acutely. But unfortunately, this story will not have a happy ending. What was supposed to be a joyful celebration turned into a real nightmare. On December 24, 2022, Elle went to a local pub with her friends to celebrate Christmas while waiting for Lucy's arrival. They had no idea that this night would be fatal for them. As an experienced detective, I have encountered similar cases more than once. Even in the brightest moments of our lives, evil may be lurking nearby, and while we carelessly celebrate, someone may be planning the most terrible things. This is exactly what happened on that Christmas night in Ollie Swilge when someone's bloody revenge destroyed the life of an innocent girl and her loved ones. Elle Edwards and her girlfriends decided to celebrate the long-awaited reunion with a bang. They chose the local pub, the Lighthouse, for this, where they planned to have a fun time while waiting for the arrival of Elle's sister Lucy. The girls could not even imagine that this night would turn into a real nightmare for them. The pub was filled with an atmosphere of joy and carefree fun. Elle and her friends laughed, danced, and sang karaoke, enjoying the festive mood. They were so caught up in the merriment that they did not notice how a person who had nothing to do with kindness and mercy appeared nearby. The Christmas idol was shattered at 23:50 when an alarming call came into the rescue service. Witnesses reported that at least 12 shots were fired at the exit of the pub, and worst of all, 2 bullets hit Elle directly. One of them seriously wounded the girl in the head. The dispatcher immediately sent emergency services to the scene. Medics urgently arrived at the pub and, having loaded Elle into an ambulance, rushed to the local hospital. They did everything possible to save the girl's life, but unfortunately, her injuries were incompatible with life. Elle died on the way to the hospital. When the police informed the family of the deceased about the tragedy, it came as a real shock to them. No one could believe that this could happen to their beloved Elle. This girl was the epitome of kindness, beauty, and joy. She had many friends, and it seemed that she could not have enemies capable of such cruelty. As an experienced detective, I understood that the investigation of this crime would not be easy. In the early stages, the investigators had no leads. The attacker appeared out of nowhere, committed his bloody massacre, and disappeared just as without a trace, leaving only shell casings and Elle's lifeless body behind. The nature of the attack indicated that it was carefully planned. The criminal thought out every step, not leaving his victim any chance of salvation. But the question that haunted us was whether Elle was the real target of the attack, or perhaps she became an accidental victim of some madman. When I heard what happened next, my breath caught in my throat from the tension. An unknown car stopped at the entrance to the pub, and a few minutes later, the shooting began. In addition to the deceased, 4 more men received gunshot wounds of varying degrees of severity. All of them were young people aged 22 to 33 who were spending time at the establishment that evening and lived in nearby suburbs. The police initially leaned towards the version that the murdered woman was an accidental victim. It was known that criminal groups periodically operated here, and the shooting probably became an ordinary showdown between their members. However, all this was just speculation that needed to be proven or disproven during the investigation, so the detectives studied the victim's personality in more detail. Elle's father, named Tim, was shocked by what happened. Just a few hours before the murder, he spoke with his daughter on the phone. They had a nice conversation and discussed the packing of Christmas gifts that Tim was doing. Like the witnesses of the crime, the victim's relatives did not think who could have wished for Elle's death. The girl seemed to have no ill wishes or enemies who could be capable of such horrors. The detectives decided to interview other witnesses and victims of the unknown criminal's bullets. In addition, law enforcement officers requested video surveillance footage from the pub owner. It was necessary to talk to dozens of people and analyze several hours of video recording. Friends, a very important point: the creation of such content requires a lot of time, and now my channel and I are going through a difficult financial situation. I will be immensely grateful to you if you become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. And in return, I will be able to personally respond to you in the comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become sponsors, I will be immensely grateful to you. Eyewitnesses reported that shortly before the shooting, an unknown car stopped at the entrance to the pub, and just a few minutes later, shots rang out, taking the life of Elle and injuring 4 more young men. These guys, aged 22 to 33, just like Elle, were simply spending time at the Lighthouse pub on that fatal evening. They did not even suspect that they would become victims of a brutal attack. All the injured were local residents who lived in the nearest suburbs of Swilj. At the beginning of the investigation, we had a version that Elle could have been an accidental victim of the shooting. The fact is that this was not the calmest area of the city. Local criminal groups periodically operated here, so the first thought was that the shooting could be related to a showdown between gangs. But as an experienced detective, I'll say that it's not worth jumping to conclusions. These were just guesses that needed careful verification. Therefore, the cops began to study in more detail the personality of the deceased girl to understand if she could have enemies capable of such a terrible crime. The investigators decided to question other witnesses of the tragedy and victims of the unknown shooter's bullets. Perhaps one of them noticed something important that could shed light on this dark story. Also, law enforcement requested video surveillance footage from the pub owner. This was a chance to track the movement of the criminal and understand how he ended up near the lighthouse on that fatal night. Even with my experience working in the police, I was stunned by what happened next. Pay attention to some details regarding the car that the criminal was driving. This information turned out to be quite contradictory because witnesses of the event described the vehicle differently. Due to the darkness and panic, it was extremely difficult to see anything specific. However, after a thorough analysis of all the testimonies, the most likely version was a dark-colored Mercedes A-Class. And this guess was confirmed when the police studied the footage from external video surveillance cameras. An interesting fact was that the killer did not immediately open fire on the visitors of the pub. At first, he drove into the parking lot and for some time simply observed what was happening inside the establishment. It seemed that the attacker was waiting for something or someone. From the place where he stopped the car, there was an excellent view of the entrance to the pub and most of the premises. Obviously, the attacker was waiting for the most opportune moment for his bloody attack. And that moment came when Elle appeared on the street. The criminal quickly jumped out of the car, fired 12 shots into the crowd, and then just as quickly returned to the driver's seat and disappeared in an unknown direction. After a thorough study of all the surveillance camera recordings, the investigators came to an important conclusion: the attacker acted alone. There were no signs that anyone was helping him. Unfortunately, it was not possible to track the exact escape route of the criminal. Therefore, the police had to resort to a large-scale door-to-door survey. They talked to every resident of the neighborhood, describing the car and the circumstances of the crime, hoping to obtain at least some lead that would help identify the killer. Patrolling the streets of Swilj took place around the clock, and these efforts were not in vain. Just 2 days after the shooting, detectives managed to detain 2 suspects at once. The police immediately informed the public and the media about this. But the names of the detainees were not disclosed until all the circumstances of the case were fully clarified. The only thing that became known was that the suspects were a 30-year-old man and a 19-year-old girl. But the investigation failed to prove their involvement in this terrible crime. During searches in the homes of the detainees, the weapon from which people were shot at near the pub was not found. Even now, as I'm telling you about this, I feel goosebumps running down my spine. After unsuccessful attempts to detain the real perpetrators of this terrible crime, the local police decided to make an official statement. They assured the public that they would not rest until the unknown shooter was behind bars and brought to justice. This statement was intended to at least slightly reassure the local residents of Swilj, who were extremely outraged by the rampant crime on the streets of their city and the obvious powerlessness of the authorities. People felt unprotected and left to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, during the investigation, a new version emerged regarding the possible reasons for the attack. It was assumed that the shooting in the Lighthouse pub could be due to enmity between local gangster groups, and Elle, in this case, was just an accidental victim who simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, it is worth noting that at that moment, these were only guesses that required thorough verification. The investigators had yet to find strong evidence that would confirm or refute this version. During further investigation, it was established that the potential targets of the shooter that night could have been Jake Duffy and Kieran Seld, members of one of the local gangs who were also relaxing in the pub on that ill-fated evening. As it turned out, these two had been in a fierce confrontation with another criminal group for a long time, which was trying to establish control over this part of the city. So it is quite likely that it was this enmity that could have caused the bloody massacre. On December 29, law enforcement officers managed to detain another suspect in this case. But as in the case with those previously arrested, it was not possible to prove his involvement in the shooting. The man had a reliable alibi that completely excluded him from the circle of suspects in the commission of this particular crime. However, the detectives assumed that the detainee could have been involved in organizing the attack. Perhaps he played the role of an accomplice or a spotter, but it was extremely difficult to prove this. Around the same time, the investigation finally managed to identify the car that the shooter was driving. It turned out to be a dark Mercedes that the criminal left in the parking lot near the pub. True, due to the lack of direct evidence, the name of the owner of this car was also not disclosed. But finding this car was not so easy. Detectives had to carefully study the footage from numerous video cameras. What happened next can only be compared to the plot of a high-octane thriller. At the time when it seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end, an event occurred that could have been a real breakthrough in this intricate case. On December 31, the police received a report of a fire that happened very close to the place where the attack on the visitors of the pub was committed. When our colleagues arrived at the call, they saw a shocking picture, a dark Mercedes, which, according to the description of witnesses, very much resembled the car of the criminals, was completely engulfed in flames. The vehicle was burning like a torch, and it was clear that it could no longer be saved. This was a real blow to the investigation. After all, not only possible material evidence that could shed light on the identities of the attackers burned in the fire, but also perhaps the murder weapon itself. The experts could only throw up their hands. The chances of finding something valuable after such a fire were practically zero. Of course, the detectives immediately suspected that this was an intentional arson. The criminals, apparently, felt that the police were getting close to revealing their identities and decided to destroy all possible evidence of their involvement in this bloody massacre. However, even despite the fact that the fire left almost no traces, forensic scientists still managed to establish one important detail: this Mercedes was used during the attack on the pub. True, the car itself did not belong to the criminals, but was stolen shortly before the tragic events of Christmas night. Such a brazen attempt to hide traces only confirmed the investigators' guesses that representatives of the criminal world were behind the shooting. It is quite likely that the arson was only one of the elements of a carefully planned operation to eliminate competitors. It would seem that after this, the investigation would again find itself at a dead end. But on January 11, a real breakthrough occurred. Two suspects in this case were delivered to the police station at once. They turned out to be a 22-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman who were detained in central Wales. The young man, who was called Connor Chapman, was of particular interest to the detectives. Why? Because he was already well known to law enforcement officers for his criminal biography. Over the past 5 years before the murder of L. Edwards, Chapman managed to light up in numerous offences and crimes. Connor started, like many others, with minor violations of the law. But over time, his appetites grew, and he plunged deeper and deeper into the criminal swamp. It seemed that this guy was not going to stop there at all, and in every possible way sought to establish himself in the status of a reckless criminal. The detention of Chapman certainly added optimism to the investigation. It only remained to hope that the interrogation of this suspect would finally provide answers to the questions that had been haunting all of Ollie Swilge for so long. After all, every resident of this small town wanted only one thing: that those guilty of the death of innocent L would be brought to justice. I almost fell off my chair when I heard what happened next. I would like to focus your attention on the personality of one of the main suspects, Connor Chapman. His biography is a prime example of how a person can find himself on the wrong path and eventually slide to the very bottom of the criminal world. As it became known from police archives, one of Connor's first serious crimes was car theft. And this was not an ordinary theft. The guy committed this crime under aggravating circumstances. That is, from the very beginning of his criminal career, Chapman acted boldly and uncompromisingly. Later, his name began to appear in case files about robberies, hooliganism, and threats. It seemed that this young man was simply incapable of living according to the law and received some kind of perverse pleasure from violating all possible rules and norms. Once Connor even became a participant in a real Hollywood-style chase. Fleeing from the police, he abandoned the stolen car and tried to hide in the bushes. And even when he was caught up and detained by law enforcement officers, this young criminal managed to make a surprised face and declare that he did not understand at all what the chase in question was about. According to him, he was just waiting in those bushes for his friend. Chapman's cynicism knew no bounds. But it was this very adventure that made him truly famous. The press started talking about the desperate guy. His name flashed on the front pages of local newspapers. Interestingly, Connor grew up in Birkenhead, a suburb of Liverpool, under the care of his grandmother and grandfather. His parents left the boy in early childhood, so the elderly relatives had to take care of raising their grandson. Despite all their efforts, Connor embarked on a criminal path early. Chapman's problems with the law began in his teens. He dropped out of school shortly before the final exams, although, to be honest, No one had any particular hopes for him. The guy had always studied poorly and was considered a problem child. Connor first found himself in the dock in 2014 when he was only 14. Then he was accused of shoplifting. Who knows, maybe it was the lenient sentence for this crime that inspired the teenager to further offenses. Already in 2016, Chapman again came to the attention of law enforcement. This time he was caught during another car theft. The guy was detained right in the stolen car, behind the wheel of which he was without a license and insurance. Moreover, by his actions, Connor violated the conditions of the previous sentence, according to which he was released early. Another year passed, and in 2017 Chapman distinguished himself again. This time, in addition to the traditional car theft, there was also the possession of prohibited psychotropic substances. And again, the guy ignored all the prohibitions and warnings, because at that time he was already under police supervision. The denouement of this story turned out to be so shocking that I still can't find the words to describe my emotions. As a result of his illegal actions, the guy was banned from visiting several areas of the city. He was clearly ordered not to appear in public places, because with his behavior he posed a real threat to others. But could such bans stop Connor? Already the next year, 2018, he again came to the attention of the police when he was detained during a patrol. And again in a public place and with weapons and prohibited substances. It's hard to believe that this guy had barely turned 18 at the time. It was then that Connor Chapman's name first hit the pages of newspapers. This happened after his next attempt to escape from law enforcement officers in a stolen car. Patrolmen noticed a local Audi on the street that was moving with violations. They immediately demanded that the driver stop and get out of the car with his hands raised. But Connor was not going to give up so easily. He sharply pressed on the gas and began to flee, provoking a real chase in the style of action movies. During this crazy race, the young criminal managed to violate, it seems, all possible traffic rules. Chapman constantly exceeded the speed limit, accelerating to 80 km/h where the maximum allowed speed was 30. He repeatedly drove into the oncoming lane, risking not only his own life, but also the safety of other road users. The finale of this story was quite expected. Unable to cope with the control on the next maneuver, Connor crashed into the curb. From a strong impact, the car was turned around and thrown to the side of the road. The hapless driver himself miraculously managed to get out of the mangled car unharmed. But his adventures that day did not end there. Jumping out of the wrecked car, Connor rushed headlong to flee, trying to hide from the police and the roadside bushes. However, this did not help him. The patrol officers caught up with the fugitive after only a few hundred meters. And even in this seemingly hopeless situation, Chapman managed to wriggle out. When he was being detained, the guy stated with an absolutely sincere look that he was just waiting in those bushes for his buddy. Of course, no one believed this excuse. His lie was too obvious. During the trial, Connor's lawyer tried to justify his client, claiming that he simply fell under the harmful influence of older comrades. Like Chapman himself is not a bad person who should not be thrown behind bars, but released to freedom, giving a chance to reform. The defender even stated that his client allegedly had attention deficit disorder and a whole bunch of other mental disorders. However, all these tricks did not help. The court found Connor guilty on all charges. The motive for the murder was as simple as a door. It was competition between two local gangs. Connor simply blindly killed an innocent person to satisfy the needs of the gang who were dividing this territory at the time, and after which he was supposed to go to Spain to cover his tracks. This scoundrel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to early release after 48 years. The guy also received a ban on driving a car, which was in effect after his release. Thus, the novice criminal achieved 14 convictions for 30 criminal episodes by the time he reached the age of majority. Obviously, he was not going to change and categorically refused to fit into society. Everyone understood that he was potentially dangerous, but there were no legal grounds for isolating him from the father of the murdered woman. Announced his desire to organize a fund to support victims similar to his daughter. He believed that the main goal would be to fight for a reduction in the number of weapons in the hands of civilians. The bereaved man wanted this tragic accident to become a lesson and help save the lives of the same innocent people in the future. Many of us are familiar with youthful mistakes and doubts when choosing a life path. Something similar happened to the heroine of today's story, who could not define her own feelings. She was too young to realize how risky love triangles can be. Unfortunately, the girl did not have time to grasp this. Kaylee Mundy was only 19 years old, and she was a second-year student at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, USA. She was in a romantic relationship with a 22-year-old man named Mark Houghton. At the same time, Kaylee found herself faced with a difficult choice, as in addition to Mark, she continued to maintain a connection with her ex-boyfriend Jet Burcham. Kaylee had previously dated him, and even after meeting Mark, she wavered between these two young men for a long time. You can't even imagine how fatal this reckless love triangle turned out to be for her. On October 29, 2017, Kaylee, along with her boyfriend Mark Howden, attended the annual music festival in San Antonio. There, the lovers drank alcohol, smoked marijuana, and then mutually decided to make love in the car. After that, the girl unexpectedly passed out. Mark, noticing that she was not breathing, quickly put her in the car and rushed her to the nearest hospital. It seemed nothing unusual, right? But no, my dears, everything turned out to be extremely tragic. If you're interested in learning about this horrific incident, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. This will greatly support me as an author. The doctors made every effort, using various methods and equipment to save Kaylee's life. Unfortunately, this was unsuccessful. The doctors were forced to declare the death of the 19-year-old cheerleader Kaylee Murdaugh due to the injuries sustained, and the girl had many injuries. When Kaylee's mother first saw her daughter in the hospital, it even seemed to her that she had been hit by a train or a truck, or that she had fallen from a plane, so mutilated was the girl's body. There was practically no uninjured spot on her. When the victim was brought to the hospital, her condition was extremely serious. The doctors performed artificial respiration at least 7 times, and they managed to start her heart. However, each time after that, it unfortunately stopped. Kaylee fell into a deep coma, so initially the doctors connected her to life support systems. The fight for the girl's life lasted 2 days, but eventually it became clear that Kaylee's brain was dead. The doctors had to inform her parents that there was no hope for recovery. For this reason, the decision was made to disconnect the girl from the artificial ventilation system. Unfortunately, this tragic decision was the most difficult thing Kaylee's parents could experience in their lives, but despite this, her relatives insisted that her last wish must be fulfilled. Kaylee had always wanted her organs to be donated to save other people's lives in case of such a tragedy. Her mother was constantly in the ward, and until the very end did not believe in the reality of what was happening. But unfortunately, it was true. According to the forensic expert's conclusion, the cause of death was a traumatic brain injury. The deceased was found to have a fractured skull and elbow bone, resulting from blows with a blunt object. In addition, the cheerleader's body was so mutilated that her relatives simply refused to believe that a human being could have done such a thing. It rather seemed as though the girl had been in some terrible accident or was killed by a maniac. You know, in my practice I've seen a lot of bloody cases, but looking at the photos from the hospital, my blood just runs cold. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you due to YouTube's policy. This is a very sad case because at the time of the tragedy, Kaylee had just turned 19. She was a second-year student at Trinity University, where she studied public relations. Kaylee was a bright, popular, and respected girl in the university's female community. She was a cheerleader, easily made friends, was sociable, and naturally fit into any company. People were drawn to her. According to Kaylee's best friend, the girl was interested not only in studying, but also in building her personal life and enjoyed entertainment. Her whole life was ahead of her. Immediately after entering the university, Kaylee fell in love with her first boyfriend, Jet Burcham. He became her first and only truly strong feeling that she could not forget. The young people met in their first year. The guy was a talented athlete, and they immediately felt an attraction. The girl called him her dream and was incredibly proud of their relationship. However, in the opinion of the deceased's mother, it was a typical teenage love. The couple occasionally had arguments, and their feelings would flare up and die down with new intensity. By the second year, Kaylee was already convinced that Jet shared her plans for the future to get married and have children. But then the girl began to realize that the guy took life too lightly and did not think about the future prospects. When Kaylee became aware of this, she decided to move on. It was at this time that the girl met Mark Howden. He did not study at Trinity University, but was visiting friends there. An immediate mutual attraction arose between Kaylee and Mark. They got along wonderfully and started dating. But the girl was unable to completely break off contact with Jet. Thus, she effectively found herself in a relationship with 2 guys at the same time. This became her fatal mistake. Moreover, both young men knew about Kaylee's affairs. It seemed as though the girl had arranged some kind of competition or race where she intended to choose the better of them. But for obvious reasons, both guys were categorically against Kaylee's experiments and tried in every way to get her to make a final choice. But the young people did not have time to resolve this conflict. Literally a month after the second suitor appeared, the girl ended up in the hospital with injuries incompatible with life. He brought her there in his car around 10:30 p.m. on October 29, 2017. While the doctors were fighting for the victim's life, the police were already talking to 22-year-old Mark. For this, they took him to the most secluded place they could find in the hospital, the chapel there. According to Mark, the couple spent the weekend at the music festival in San Antonio, where they drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. The police found out that such a recreation scenario was a common thing for them. Further, as Mark reported, approximately between 5 and 6 p.m. they went for a ride in his Mercedes. During this trip, an argument flared up between the lovers. Kaylee confessed that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend Jet. Mark apparently tried to convince her to break up with her ex-boyfriend and stop any communication with his company. Eventually, he managed to calm Kaylee down, and she agreed to think about his words. Later, Mark continued. The couple stopped at a deserted parking lot near a gas station, where they engaged in intimate relations. According to the guy, their sex was rough. He claimed that he strangled the girl, slapped her in the face, but assured that Kaylee liked it. She enjoyed intense sensations. Despite numerous attempts by the police to latch onto the facts stated by Mark, he steadfastly stood his ground, claiming that everything happened by mutual consent. Was it really like that? Unfortunately, it turned out not to be so simple. Events unfolded not according to the usual scenario. As Mark reported, after sex, he and Kaylee talked for about 5 more minutes, and then the girl started complaining of a headache. But the guy did not attach much importance to it, attributing it to an excess of alcohol. When a few seconds later, Kaylee suddenly passed out and started snoring, Mark still did not sound the alarm. He allegedly decided to take the girl to his apartment in Houston because he thought she had just fallen asleep under the influence of fatigue, alcohol, and drugs. At some point, Kaylee stopped snoring and stopped showing any signs of life at all. That's when the young man became worried. Mark tried to feel for a pulse, but it seemed to him that there was none, and he did not notice any breathing. Only after that did the guy rush to the hospital. Mark claimed to be extremely worried, concerned about Kaylee's condition, and hurried to try to save her life. The detectives who began investigating this incident had no doubt that the girl's horrific body condition was the result of a vicious attack. They interrogated Mark several times, but there was nothing to latch onto. The only inconsistency that immediately caught the eye was the indication of where the car was located. At first, Mark reported that he and Kaylee had spent time at a gas station, and then admitted that they had driven to a deserted parking lot behind it. But in general, these details did not compromise him in any way. The guy did not confess to the murder, and there was a lack of concrete evidence against him. So Mark was released without being charged, although of course he remained the prime suspect. After all, no one believed his story. It was obvious that the girl had been brutally abused before her death. The situation changed radically only after 3 months when the full report of the forensic expert arrived. In the opinion of the specialist, Kaylee died as a result of blunt facial and head trauma, so everything that happened was reclassified as intentional murder. On this basis, on February 28, 2018, Mark was arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, and rape. However, even then, the young man did not admit his guilt, and later he was even released on bail until the start of the trial. It would seem obvious the girl was last with Mark, so he should be held accountable. But the deeper the police delved into the details of the investigation, the more thoroughly they studied the identity of the suspect and the circumstances of the victim's life, the more they revealed a whole tangle of tragic mistakes, fatal coincidences, and misunderstandings that ultimately led Kaylee to the forensic expert's table. Mark's relatives and friends immediately hired a lawyer for him to defend the innocent young man in their opinion. The lawyer was convinced that the young man was being unfairly held accountable. The lawyer believed that the charges were the result of the negligence and bias of the investigation. In his view, Mark was not involved in the assault, and the cause of the girl's injuries could have been an ordinary fall at the music festival or 2 vigorous efforts by doctors during attempts to save her life. The police's work was significantly complicated by the fact that the officers were unable to find anyone who witnessed what happened, despite the fact that everything took place at a crowded concert. The suspect's lawyer insisted that his client could not have committed such a brutal crime because his behavior did not generally correspond to that of a typical murderer. Instead of trying to cover up the evidence and dispose of the body, Mark himself took the victim to the hospital in an attempt to save her. Of course, the defense tried in every way to create as positive an image of their client as possible. Unfortunately, as the prosecution later discovered, an incredibly experienced and influential lawyer was working with the suspect. It was not until December 2019, a full 2 years after the tragedy, that Mark stood trial for the murder of Kaylee. From the prosecution's point of view, on October 29, 2017, the defendant forcibly dragged the student into his car, effectively kidnapping her from the music festival. Then he drove her to a deserted parking lot behind a gas station. It was there that Mark, enraged by the argument and jealousy of the other guy, brutally abused Kaylee, beating her, raping her, until the girl experienced a brain hemorrhage that caused irreversible consequences. When the victim stopped showing any signs of life, the young man became scared and tried to rectify the situation by getting to the hospital. He really hoped that the doctors would be able to save Kaylee. However, in the opinion of the lawyer, this version of the accusation was flawed from beginning to end, starting with the moment of kidnapping and ending with the beatings and rape. The defender appealed to the fact that the prosecution did not have a single direct witness who could confirm the kidnapping, who saw the girl being forcibly placed in the car and taken away from the festival venue. The defense put forward the assumption that the active attempts to save Kaylee's life and the intensive resuscitation measures by the doctors could have been the cause of the bruises and other injuries on her body. It was known that the doctors performed indirect heart massage on the girl at least 7 times before realizing the futility of these efforts. Unfortunately, the only person who could confirm or refute Mark's version was dead, and although the lawyer's version about the infliction of injuries by doctors sounded extremely doubtful, the prosecution had to rule out all unlikely scenarios claimed by the defense, and for this, witnesses were needed who could shed light on at least some part of the events of that tragic evening. First of all, the investigators interviewed the paramedics who were on duty at the ambulance and were the first to start rescuing the student. Their crew was standing in the parking lot near the emergency room, waiting for the next call. Suddenly, a car stopped behind them with a wild screech of tires. The driver, waving his arms in panic, called for help. It was Mark Howerton. He quickly led the paramedics to his car and showed them the unconscious Kaylee. Mark begged them to save the girl, who had allegedly stopped breathing. When the doctors looked into the car, their vigilance only grew. Naked Kaylee was lying in the car. Her pants and t-shirt were on the floor. The girl showed no signs of life, and her body was covered in bruises. Even on the inside of her thighs, there were characteristic finger imprints. Kaylee was barely breathing, and her pulse was faint, so the doctors immediately began resuscitation measures, artificial respiration, indirect heart massage. A detailed examination of the victim was out of the question at the time her life was at stake. These testimonies of the doctors completely refuted Mark's lie that the bruises appeared on Kaylee only after she arrived at the hospital, allegedly from 2 intense resuscitation attempts. After all, everyone who saw the girl during her arrival at the hospital unanimously stated that hematomas had already covered her entire body at that time. Moreover, several witnesses drew attention to Mark's strange appearance. His fists, according to those present, were dirty and red, as if the guy had been fighting with someone for a long time before bringing Kaylee to the hospital. It later turned out that Mark was quite muscular and athletic, and he took steroids to increase his muscle mass. And this excessive preoccupation with anabolic steroids, according to his acquaintances, began to provoke sudden mood swings, outbursts of aggression, and uncontrolled fits of rage in the young man. Such a steroid effect could explain the brutal assault on Kaylee that evening. The girl may have inadvertently provoked her boyfriend's anger with a careless word or gesture. At first, Mark cooperated quite willingly with the investigation, even allowing his car to be inspected without a warrant. In the car, detectives found a gun and drugs. The defense skillfully used these circumstances to the benefit of their client. The lawyer argued that no one guilty of a serious crime would be so openly cooperative with the police. However, the prosecution quickly saw through this cunning move by the suspect. In their opinion, Mark was deliberately pretending to be innocent and assisting the investigation in every way to deflect any suspicion from himself. The police continued to pressure the guy, and eventually it paid off. They managed to find out that Mark had previously shown aggression towards Kaylee. A few weeks before the tragedy, one such conflict ended with a police call. At that time, Kaylee simply fled from her enraged boyfriend, who nearly beat her in the dorm. When the law enforcement officers arrived in response to the call, they saw that the room was turned upside down, broken furniture, a smashed laptop, scattered belongings, clothes in the trees outside the window. According to neighbors, Mark caused a terrible mess, but Kaylee then withdrew her complaint and asked not to disclose the details. Kaylee's friends said that after that incident, the couple's relationship seemed to have ended. Kaylee did not want to even talk to Mark and ignored his calls, but later the former lovers reconciled. During the court hearing, the prosecution demonstrated the couple's personal correspondence. The context of the messages made it clear that Mark reacted very painfully to any hints about a possible breakup. For example, in one of the photos, he was holding a gun to his temple and threatening to kill himself if Kaylee did not call him. Thus, Kaylee found herself drawn into an extremely dangerous and morbid love triangle. The girl did not dare to completely break up with Mark, fearing that he really might commit suicide, and at the same time, she could not give up her feelings for the other guy, her ex-boyfriend Jet. Kaylee herself repeatedly confessed to her friends that she was in love with both of them, which made it so difficult for her to make a choice. At the trial, the prosecution argued that on the eve of the tragedy, in October 2017, Kaylee finally decided to break this oppressive bond. It was about this that she informed Jet during the festival. The girl wanted to break up with Mark right after the concert, and until then, she stayed close to him to protect herself from possible aggression in a crowded place. However, as soon as the lovers found themselves alone, the jealous Mark, according to the prosecution's version, forcibly dragged the girl into the car and drove her to a deserted place, where he brutally assaulted her. Unfortunately, the key witness in this case was supposed to be Jet Burcham, Kaylee's other boyfriend. And indeed, during the first court hearing, it was thanks to his testimony that the prosecution had grounds to accuse Mark of kidnapping, rape, and murder. But very quickly, the defense managed to discredit Jet's testimony. As it turned out, he was not actually an eyewitness to the kidnapping. Jet did not see firsthand how Mark forcibly put Kaylee in his car, although he initially claimed that he had personally witnessed this. This all came to light when the lawyer started cornering the guy, asking him why he did not rush to the girl's aid if he had witnessed the violence. In reality, Kaylee and Mark had disappeared from Jet's sight even before that moment. He could not have witnessed their departure, and he was relaying second-hand information, although he was unable to name those people. All of this gave the defense grounds to accuse Jet of false testimony and dealt a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Their main witness now looked extremely unreliable, which undermined confidence in his words. In addition, during the trial, photos of drugs, suspicious contacts, and correspondence were found on Jet Burcham's mobile phone. This gave grounds to suspect the guy of drug abuse and involvement in drug distribution. It later turned out that at the time of Kaylee's death, her ex-boyfriend was on probation. He had previously been arrested for selling marijuana, and among the youth of San Antonio, Jet had a reputation as a well-known dealer. The defense conducted a harsh cross-examination, and at some point, Burcham began to evade answering questions, citing his constitutional rights. For a guy who had cooperated with law enforcement and received immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for his testimony, such behavior seemed extremely strange. It seemed as though he was afraid of exposing himself in some dubious dealings that were unrelated to Kaylee's case. Additionally, Mark's lawyer managed to find out that Jet had previous legal problems. Shortly before the incident with Kaylee, he had been expelled from the university for harassing another student who had filed a police report. At that time, Jet was able to settle the conflict by promising to voluntarily leave the educational institution. So the defense openly pressured the jurors, portraying Jet as a real scoundrel, a drug dealer, harasser, and liar. Who would believe such a witness? But the prosecution did not give up. In order to dispel any doubts about the causes of Kaylee's death, the prosecution brought in several independent experts. The forensic experts came to an unambiguous conclusion: the head trauma that caused the massive brain hemorrhage and ultimately the girl's death could in no way have been sustained as a result of her short stay in the hospital, as the defense had insisted. The lawyer's version that Kaylee had allegedly fallen and hit her head after being hospitalized sounded completely absurd. The girl had lost consciousness even before arriving at the clinic, so all the efforts of the doctors were aimed precisely at trying to revive her. So it was highly unlikely that they would have allowed someone to strike the patient so hard that she sustained a fatal traumatic brain injury. However, several experts brought in by the defense suggested that some of the bruises on the victim's body could have appeared as a result of her preparation for organ donation, a procedure that Kaylee herself had insisted on while still alive. Based on data about the nature and location of the injuries, forensic experts used 3D modeling to recreate the circumstances of the attack on the girl. These materials clearly demonstrated to the jurors that Kaylee's death was undoubtedly the result of a brutal beating, not an accident or medical negligence. The results of the toxicological examination were also a significant argument for the prosecution. The analysis of Kaylee's blood showed a high content of psychoactive substances that increased blood pressure and, consequently, the risk of internal bleeding and rupture of blood vessels. Therefore, Mark's defenders appealed to this fact, saying that with such a cocktail in the body, even a minor head injury could have provoked a fatal brain hemorrhage, which is what happened to the girl. However, the prosecution insisted that this was a case of intentional murder. After all, neither an accidental fall nor a medical error could explain the broken nose, split lip, bruises on the neck, and other characteristic injuries that eloquently testified to the girl's brutal beating. Eventually, after intense and lengthy debates between the parties, the jurors retired to the deliberation room to render a verdict. Just a few hours later, the defense received a shocking phone call. An unexpected witness contacted the lawyer, claiming that he had seen Kaylee's condition during her hospitalization. It was a duty nurse from the emergency room where the girl ended up. He assured them that when Kaylee was first brought in, there were no bruises on her body. In his opinion, that the hematomas could have arisen from internal bleeding due to prolonged cardiac arrests and measures taken to prepare the body for organ removal. Such testimony could have completely cleared Mark Houghton of the charges, but as the judge explained to the lawyer at this stage, it was no longer possible to involve new witnesses. The jury's deliberations lasted more than 10 hours. For 2 days, they were unable to reach a consensus. The court was unable to satisfy the thirst for justice of the deceased girl's relatives. The jurors proved unable to render a unanimous verdict regarding the defendant's guilt. As a result, the court was forced to declare the previous trial improper and schedule a retrial. Despite this interim result, both sides stated that they were ready to continue defending their positions. The defense planned to seek a complete review of the case, including due to Jet Bertram's dishonest testimony and the appearance of a new witness. As for Terry Murdaugh's parents, despite everything, they had no doubts about Mark's guilt. They were determined to continue seeking to hold their daughter's abuser accountable, and very soon their hopes were fulfilled. The prosecution refiled charges against Mark Houghton. In June 2023, a new trial began. This time, it was held behind closed doors without access for the press or outsiders. So many details remained unknown to the general public. Initially, in 2018, the young man faced life in prison. But during the retrial, the qualification of the crime and the measure of punishment were somewhat mitigated. Now Mark was charged with assault under aggravating circumstances, which carried a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. At this stage, the prosecution brought in a new expert, a specialist in domestic violence. He vividly depicted Mark's psychological portrait to the jurors as a classic abuser, a jealous owner who sought by any means to cut off Kaylee from all contact with the outside world, intimidated her, humiliated her, threatened her, and eventually could not restrain himself and crippled the girl in a fit of rage. In the expert's opinion, the 19-year-old Kaylee, due to her young age and inexperience, simply did not realize who she was dealing with and what danger she was in. As in the previous trial, a heated discussion about the nature of Kaylee's injuries unfolded in the courtroom. The defense was still unable to involve the new witness in the case, that same nurse who allegedly saw the girl's condition before the bruises appeared. Therefore, the prosecution's version turned out to be more convincing. Eventually, despite all the objections and attempts to play on the jurors' sympathies, Mark lost. He was found guilty and sentenced to the maximum term of 20 years in prison. Such is the sad and instructive story of Terry Murdaugh. A very young, inexperienced girl, blinded by love, failed to notice that her chosen one was a dangerous and unpredictable type. The one who swore to love and protect her turned out to be a real monster, and it cost Kaylee her life. Let this tragedy serve as a warning to all of us. Be cautious and careful in relationships. Do not ignore warning signs. Remember, if someone truly loves you, they will never express their feelings through rudeness, control, threats, or blackmail. These are signs of an unhealthy relationship that you need to get out of immediately. Unfortunately, Kaylee and her relatives did not attach importance to these red flags. The girl believed that she could tame her chosen one's evil temper and appealed to his common sense. But someone who is used to pressuring and intimidating rarely stops on their own. That is why victims of violence should seek help as soon as possible. Nowadays, in the USA, as in many other countries, there is an entire system to protect and support victims of domestic abuse. Crisis centers, hotlines, community organizations operate. The police, courts, and social services are all called upon to protect the vulnerable and prevent such tragedies. This is Holly Bobo, a 20-year-old girl from Tennessee who was on the brink of a new life. She was about to finish her studies and dedicate herself to the noble profession of nursing. It seemed like nothing could overshadow her future until one April day in 2011, she vanished without a trace. Her brother was the last person to see Holly alive. According to him, he witnessed a strange scene. Holly was talking to an unknown man in their home's garage. This stranger, whose face remains in the shadows to this day, grabbed the girl and forcibly took her to the nearest forest. I can only imagine the horror that gripped Holly at that moment. Despite a quick call to the police, it was too late. By the time law enforcement arrived at the scene, the perpetrator had already managed to disappear with his victim. A race against time began in which, unfortunately, the criminal proved to be more cunning. Holly, a native of the quiet town, was a true child of nature. Countless photos show her in camouflage together with her family as they explore the local forests and hills. Nature was her second home, but despite her love for outdoor activities, Holly was not a very sociable person. At her core, she was rather shy and reserved. But this quiet exterior hid an unwavering inner confidence. She knew exactly who she was and what she wanted out of life. Everyone asked themselves the question, what really happened to Holly on that fateful April morning? And will the truth ever be revealed? I will tell you all about it right now, but traditionally only to those wonderful and incredible people who right now will subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comment to promote this video. These 3 simple actions will help conscious people find and watch this video and realize what problems exist in society and what should always be paid attention to. Holly grew up in the small town of Darden, Tennessee, with a population of just over 3,000 residents. It was a quiet, cozy corner, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. An ideal place to raise children and enjoy a peaceful life. As a detective, I have seen many towns, but Darden immediately captured my heart with its simplicity and sincerity. Locals were proud that Darden was a middle-class stronghold. Crime here was at a record low, and the cost of living allowed even middle-income families to feel comfortable. All the ingredients for a happy life were in Darden: safety, tranquility, proximity to nature. No wonder Holly loved her hometown so much. But despite her devotion to Darden, Holly had ambitious plans for the future. She was studying at a college in neighboring Parsons at the University of Tennessee's Nursing Center. It was a small but cozy building where several hundred young and eager students like Holly diligently mastered the basics of medicine. Parsons, although larger than Darden, was also a fairly quiet town. But for students, everything they needed was here: quality education, a friendly atmosphere, and even a few shops where they could have fun after stressful classes. Holly felt like a fish in water here. By the way, what Holly valued most was the opportunity to escape from the noisy city life. Parsons was a quiet haven for her, where she could focus on her studies and her dreams. And although she enjoyed spending time with her family in Darden, Parsons gave her a sense of freedom and independence, so necessary for growing up. The short distance between Darden and Parsons allowed Holly to easily combine her studies and family life. She could devote time to classes without sacrificing warm family moments. It seemed like she had the perfect life: loving parents, close relationships with her brother, and a promising future. As an experienced detective, I have seen many examples of how crime can shake even the most peaceful towns. But it was hard to imagine anything bad in Darden and Parsons. But despite the apparent idyll, danger lurked very close. And when it finally struck, no one was ready. Not Holly's family, not the residents of Darden, not law enforcement. Holly's disappearance was a blow from which the town took a long time to recover. After all, if this could happen to Holly, a girl everyone knew and loved, then no one was safe. Now, looking back, it's easy to see the alarming signs. But then, in those carefree days, no one could have imagined that Holly's life was about to change forever. And with it, the lives of everyone who knew and loved her. On the fateful morning of April 13, 2011, nothing foreshadowed trouble. Holly woke up early around 4:30 to prepare for an important exam. She didn't know that this was the last normal morning of her life. The last hours of carefree existence before her world turned upside down. Around 7:30, Holly received a call from her boyfriend, Drew Scott. He had just returned from hunting turkeys in his grandparents' backyard. It was a usual morning for Drew, while for Holly it was to be a fateful one. None of them could have imagined the tragedy that was looming at the time. At that point, Holly's parents had already left for work, and her brother Clint was still sleeping in his room. The house was immersed in morning silence, which was about to be shattered by terrible events. Around 7:40, just 12 minutes after talking to Drew, Holly made her last call. She didn't know yet that these were her last minutes of freedom. From that moment on, all of Holly's calls and messages went unanswered. Drew, who was used to being in constant contact with his girlfriend, began to worry a lot. He felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't even imagine the scale of the tragedy. The alarm was heightened by reports from neighbors about screams coming from Holly's house. A young man who lived nearby with his parents heard the commotion and immediately called his mother, and she in turn decided to warn Holly's mother. No one could understand then that behind these screams was something much more terrible than an ordinary quarrel. As it turned out later, these calls proved to be fatal. If someone had immediately rushed to Holly's aid or called the police, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. But at that moment, no one could comprehend the magnitude of the danger. Every lost minute brought Holly closer to a terrible denouement. Listening to the details of this case from my colleagues, I couldn't get rid of the thought, what if someone had reacted earlier? What if someone had listened to their instincts and intervened? Maybe they wouldn't be mourning the lost life of a young girl. But the past cannot be changed. All that remains is to learn from bitter lessons and do everything to prevent such tragedies from happening again. I don't know if Holly could have been saved because, analyzing all the events, I feel like the criminal carefully planned everything. But I do know that her story shocked not only me, but also my colleagues, which is actually rare. Meanwhile, Holly's brother, Clint, had just woken up from the barking and growling of the family dogs. Alarmed, he jumped up to see what was going on. Running to the window, Clint saw a strange scene. Holly was talking to some stranger near the family garage. This scene immediately aroused his suspicions. Looking closer, Clint noticed that the stranger was oddly similar to Drew, Holly's boyfriend. At first, he even thought it was really Drew, but something about the situation seemed wrong. They were walking back and forth, clearly arguing about something, but Clint couldn't make out a single word. The only thing he could understand was that Holly was incredibly upset. Her voice sounded broken, but she hardly said anything. Instead, the man was talking almost the entire time, his voice tense and angry. The only thing Clint could make out was how Holly firmly said no at one point and then began asking why. While Clint was watching this scene, his mother called him. He recounted to her in detail everything he saw. Clint speculated that Holly and Drew were probably breaking up, and it was all happening in their garage. He had no idea that his sister was in danger. How bitterly he later regretted this mistake. But then Holly's mother said something that made Clint's blood run cold. It wasn't Drew. She ordered Clint to shoot the stranger immediately. Clint was shocked. He still couldn't clearly see the man, but he was sure it was Drew. How could anyone expect him to shoot his sister's boyfriend? If only Clint had realized earlier that his sister was in trouble. If only he had acted more decisively, maybe things would have turned out differently. But at that moment, he simply couldn't believe that Holly was in danger in their own home, at the hands of a person he mistook for her boyfriend. I feel sorry for how often we don't notice obvious signs of danger, because they seem too incredible, too scary to be true. We dismiss the alarming bells, hoping for the best until it's too late. Of course, it's easy to judge in hindsight. But I'm sure Clint curses himself every day for that fatal mistake. He will have to live with this burden for the rest of his life. Clint, still not believing his ears, asked his mother in despair, "Do you really want me to shoot Drew?" This question seemed to only enrage her even more. She simply hung up, leaving Clint completely bewildered, and dialed 911 instead. As it turned out later, this call was a fatal mistake. Holly's mother was calling from her work number, so she was connected to the police department of another county. Every lost minute gave the perpetrator more time to cover his tracks and escape with Holly. This bureaucratic confusion cost them precious time. While Clint was trying to figure out what was happening, events were unfolding at lightning speed. He ran to the window again, but it was too late. The stranger and Holly had already gotten into the car and disappeared in the direction of the nearest forest. Clint felt his heart sink. He knew that something had gone terribly wrong. It was only at this moment that Clint finally realized that the man he saw could not be Drew. He was much taller and more muscular. But due to the distance and in the semi-darkness, Clint still couldn't get a good look at him. He tried to call Holly, although he knew the chances of an answer were slim. And indeed, she did not answer. Meanwhile, Clint's mother, realizing her mistake with the call, contacted him again. She admitted that she had failed to reach the right police department and begged Clint to do it himself. Without wasting a second, Clint grabbed a shotgun and ran out into the yard. And then his gaze fell on something that made his blood run cold. Red spots were visible on the ground near the garage. Spots that were almost certainly Holly's blood. At that moment, the full horror of the situation finally gripped Clint. He realized that his sister was in terrible danger, and every second counted. With trembling hands, he dialed 911 and described the situation as clearly as possible. But even with all the desire, it took the police about 10 minutes to get to the remote Bobo family home. And in those 10 minutes, Holly and her abductor were long gone. Frankly, I can't help but think about how many opportunities to stop this tragedy were lost due to unfortunate misunderstandings and fatal coincidences. If only Clint had realized the danger earlier, if only the call had immediately reached the right department, if only the police had arrived even a few minutes earlier, maybe things would have turned out differently. I'll tell you how it is. We need to learn to trust our instincts, act quickly and decisively when we hear a cry for help. And no less important, we must ensure that our emergency response system works like clockwork, without delays and failures. Because believe me, when life is at stake, every second is precious. As soon as Holly was declared missing, the police launched a large-scale search. They combed every corner of the city and its environs, hoping to find at least some trace that would lead them to the girl or her abductor. But unfortunately, all their efforts were in vain. It seemed as if the earth had opened up and swallowed Holly without a trace. In a desperate attempt to find a clue, the police requested records of Holly's phone conversations. They hoped they could track her location using GPS data from her mobile phone. And indeed, this yielded the first fruits. They quickly determined that immediately after the abduction, Holly's phone was heading towards the woods near her house, exactly where, according to Clint, the car with Holly and her abductor had gone. Further traces led to Interstate 40, where Holly's phone stopped briefly. And then someone made a call from her number, and the phone started moving again, this time in the opposite direction, as if someone was deliberately trying to confuse the trail. I immediately suspected that this was an attempt by the kidnapper to divert suspicion and throw up smokescreens. An investigative team was immediately dispatched to the place where the last call was made. They hoped to find Holly there, or at least some evidence that would indicate her whereabouts, but they were bitterly disappointed. After a thorough search, they returned empty-handed, no trace of Holly, no clue as to where she might have disappeared. It was a dead end that threatened the investigation from the very beginning. In this situation, the police decided to rely on Clint's testimony, the only person who had caught a glimpse of the kidnapper. The young man described him as a tall, stocky man, about 6 feet tall and weighing under 200 pounds. Dark hair, a baseball cap, mossy oak camouflage, that's all Clint remembered. No special marks, no clues that could lead to the criminal's trail. Only a deep, loud voice, so loud that Clint could hear it even from a distance. The description provided by Clint seemed quite detailed at first glance. But as it turned out, in towns like Parsons, where hunting and outdoor recreation were commonplace, practically every second man fit this description. Height about 6 feet, weight under 200 pounds, dark hair, a baseball cap, and mossy oak camouflage within a 30-mile radius of the town, there were plenty of them. This negated any attempt to compile an accurate portrait of the suspect. But the police were not going to give up. They sent out search parties throughout Parsons and the surrounding area, hoping to stumble upon some evidence or witnesses that could help the investigation, and their efforts were not in vain. Very soon, Holly's personal belongings began to be found all over the town. Here and there, someone would come across her breakfast box, a receipt with her name on it, a postcard from the college where she was studying, as if someone had deliberately scattered them to mock the police and the girl's relatives. Moreover, according to some reports, even Holly's cell phone and her SIM card were found in the town, although other sources claimed that these items, as well as the college postcard, were found in the woods near the Bobel home. In any case, these findings only confirmed the worst fears. Holly had not simply disappeared, she had become the victim of a brutal crime. The first person to come under suspicion was a local resident named Terry Britt, and no wonder Terry already had a criminal record and perfectly fit the description given by Clint. The investigators took him very seriously. They wiretapped his house, checked every corner of his possessions. But for better or worse, they found nothing suspicious. In the end, for lack of evidence, Britt had to be released. Days, weeks, months passed, and then years. It seemed that the Holly Bobo case had reached an impasse. No progress, no new leads. The girl's family still hoped for a miracle, but with each passing day, that hope faded. And then suddenly, in the fall of 2014, the unexpected happened. A group of mushroom pickers scouring the woods near Interstate 40 stumbled upon something terrifying. They immediately called the police, and then, unfortunately, only a few years later, the worst fears were confirmed. Among the autumn leaves and branches lay skeletal remains. Examination showed that these were the remains of Holly Bobo, who had disappeared 3 years earlier. I can't even imagine what Holly's family felt when they heard this news. 3 years of uncertainty, 3 years of hope, and then such a terrible denouement. It's something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And although this discovery finally provided an answer to the question of what happened to Holly, it also meant that this investigation was no longer just a disappearance. Now it was a murder investigation. Of course, as soon as Holly's remains were found, the case took on a new scope. It would seem that the police had a new lead, a new chance to stumble upon the killer's trail. But as is often the case, it turned out to be not so simple. The place where the remains were found was popular with mushroom pickers and hunters. Hundreds of people could have passed through it over the course of 3 years, trampling potential evidence. Moreover, the wooded area and weather conditions had taken their toll. Most of the traces and prints that could have led to the perpetrator were hopelessly lost. It was another dead end that threatened to bury the truth about Holly's death forever. The place where Holly's remains were found turned out to be a remote patch of forest about 20 miles from her hometown of Darden. At first glance, it seemed an odd choice after all. There were plenty of secluded, deserted places around Darden. Why did the killer take us so far? Perhaps he was afraid that someone might accidentally stumble upon the body somewhere closer to town. When investigators reached out to the owner of this plot, he was not surprised. According to him, despite the remoteness and lack of trails, this place was popular with mushroom pickers. They often wandered these woods without special permission, so it's not surprising that it was the mushroom pickers who eventually stumbled upon Holly's remains. If not for chance, the truth about her fate might never have come to light. When forensic experts began to examine the find site, a gruesome picture unfolded before them. Holly's bones were scattered over a fairly large area, as if someone or something had deliberately scattered them. But the most terrifying thing was something else. Judging by the hole in the skull, the girl had been killed by a shot to the head, executed in cold blood. It would seem that the discovery of the remains should have been a breakthrough in the investigation. But as it turned out, the police already had a prime suspect in mind and had been hunting him for at least 6 months prior to this. What's most strange is that this man was just one of 6 persons of interest in the Holly Bobo case. Yes, you heard that right, 6. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in this convoluted story. The first arrest in the Holly case took place back in March 2014, several months before her body was found. 3 men, Zach Adams, his brother Dylan, and their friend Jason, were detained on suspicion of involvement in the girl's disappearance. At that time, the investigation did not yet have a body, but there was already evidence of violent actions against Holly. Moreover, the deeper the investigators dug, the more horrifying the picture became. It turned out that before the murder, Holly had been subjected to assault. It's hard to even imagine the horror this young girl had to endure in the last hours of her life. What kind of monsters could commit such an atrocity? But the shock of this revelation was quickly replaced by an even greater shock. After the trio of main suspects were brought in for questioning, police arrested 2 more individuals on suspicion that they had helped hide Holly's body after the murder. It appeared to be an entire criminal gang, and each of them played their own gruesome role in this tragedy. You know, in my years with the police, I've seen a lot of horrible things. But the story of Holly Bobo struck even me with its senseless cruelty, the audacity of the criminals who buried the body in the woods like some kind of garbage, and then led the investigation by the nose for months. It was something out of the most terrifying crime dramas, and at the same time entirely real. But the shocking twist didn't end there. As it later turned out, there was another suspect in this case, but he committed suicide before the police could interrogate him. Such an ominous detail which only added mystery to this whole story. Who is this man? What role did he play in Holly's disappearance? And why did he choose to take his own life rather than answer the investigators' questions? Even more intriguing was the fact that the police never disclosed why these 6 men ended up on the list of suspects. Perhaps it had to do with their past, some long-ago offenses or ties to the criminal world. Or perhaps the investigators simply didn't want to reveal all their cards so as not to harm the investigation. In any case, the details remain shrouded in mystery. The only thing that leaked to the press was that one of the suspects, Dylan Adams, Zach's brother, had previously had problems with the law. Back in 2014, he had been held liable for illegal possession of weapons. Not the best characteristic for a person suspected of involvement in a brutal murder. But of course, this alone was not enough to prove his guilt. During the interrogation, Dylan told something very interesting. He claimed that on the day of Holly's disappearance, he saw her alive at his brother Zach's house. Moreover, according to documents that later became the basis for a search, Dylan had allegedly witnessed Holly being held at Zach's house on that very April 13, 2011, the day of her disappearance. According to Dylan, he came to his brother's house that day to borrow a truck. But when he went inside, he saw Holly. She was sitting in a chair in the living room and looked very bad. And then something truly horrific happened. Zach allegedly confessed to Dylan that he upped a girl and recorded it all on video. Of course, such a confession should have been a breakthrough in the investigation. But there were two problems. First, the video recording mentioned was never found as if it had never existed. Second, Dylan himself later recounted his words. He began to claim that the investigators had pressured him and demanded that he slandered his brother. And to be honest, it's not hard to believe some of the details of Dylan's story really didn't fit well with the other evidence in the case. The only thing that confirmed his words was the clothes that Zach was allegedly wearing that day. Dylan mentioned that his brother was in camouflage, and this matched the description given by the witness, Holly's brother Clint. The same description of a tall man in mossy oak camouflage who was talking to Holly in the garage shortly before her disappearance. It seemed that there really was some connection here. Overall, the situation was shaping up to be confusing and ambiguous. On the one hand, the police had serious suspicions about Zach Adams and his inner circle. Something clearly connected these people to Holly's disappearance and murder. But on the other hand, not all the confessions and testimonies seemed reliable. Some might be holding something back, while others might be adding extra details under pressure from the investigation. Unraveling this tangle and getting to the heart of the matter was oh so difficult. I'll be honest, at this stage of the investigation, my own head was spinning. So many versions, so many potential suspects, and yet no direct and unambiguous evidence. It would take a lot of effort and professionalism not to get lost in this maze, to sift the truth from the fiction, and finally bring the perpetrators to justice. And here we come to one of the most mysterious and disturbing details in this whole story. The same video that Dylan mentioned, the video that supposedly captured Zach Adams raping Holly Bobo. Of course, this immediately raised many questions and doubts. Was Dylan telling the truth? Or maybe he made up this story to divert suspicion from himself. Or maybe the video did exist, but someone made sure it disappeared forever. However, even without this video evidence, Dylan's testimony proved weighty enough for the police to take action. Based on his words, 3 main suspects in the case were arrested: Zach Adams, Jason Autry, and Shane Austin. 3 individuals who, according to the investigation, were directly involved in Holly's disappearance and murder. But the most ominous thing about all this was the fact that one of the suspects, Shane Austin, had already taken his own life by that point. He committed suicide before the police could bring official charges against him. Of course, this immediately raised new questions and suspicions. Could Shane not bear the burden of guilt? Or maybe he knew something he shouldn't have, and someone made sure he stayed silent forever. Be that as it may, now that Shane was dead, all eyes were on the other 2 suspects, Zach Adams and Jason Autry. It was their testimony that would now determine whether the investigation would finally be able to piece together a complete picture of what happened to Holly. And then there was another unexpected twist. It seems the police found a way to put pressure on Jason. They made it clear to him. If he didn't cooperate with the investigation, he risked spending the rest of his life behind bars. And I must say, this tactic worked. Soon Jason began to give testimony that seriously implicated Zach Adams. He offered to make a deal, information in exchange for a lighter sentence, and the police seemed ready to make that compromise. It was this moment when Jason began cooperating with the investigation that became a turning point in the entire case. Finally, there was a real chance to find out the truth about what happened to Holly Bobo. It seemed that just a little more, and all the pieces of this gruesome puzzle would fall into place. But as it turned out, not everyone was thrilled with this turn of events. The lawyer for the late Shane Austin reacted particularly sharply. A month before the trial began, he came out with a loud statement, accusing the police of bias and unprofessionalism. According to him, the investigators had no real evidence against Shane, at all just some theories, speculation, and rumors. Moreover, the lawyer claimed that the police had simply harassed Shane, threatened him, made him believe that he was going to be accused of a crime he did not commit. And allegedly, unable to withstand this pressure, Shane decided to take his own life. In fact, Shane's relatives, through their lawyer, accused the police of driving him to suicide. Of course, these statements made quite a stir. Although no official lawsuits were filed against the police, everyone understood that it was only a matter of time. The investigators' reputation was at stake, and if it turned out that they had indeed resorted to illegal methods of pressure, it could call into question the entire course of the investigation. I'll be frank, when I heard about these accusations, I felt quite a bit of unease. Of course, I trusted my colleagues and wanted to believe that they had acted strictly within the law. But I know all too well how dirty this business can be, especially when it comes to high-profile cases that attract the attention of the entire country. Sometimes, in the pursuit of results, people can cross the line of what is permissible. And if something like that happened in the case of Shane Austin, it could have very serious consequences.
However, no matter what the lawyer said, the fact remained. Shane Austin was dead, and 2 other suspects were in custody. And now everything depended on what Zach Adams and Jason Autry would tell. Finally, in September 2017, Zach Adams stood trial on charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder of Holly Bobo. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for 6 long years. The moment when it seemed that justice might finally be served. But as it turned out, this was only the beginning of new shocking revelations. Zach's defense immediately put forward an unexpected version. They claimed that Clint, Holly's brother, was actually acquainted with the suspects. Moreover, according to them, on the day of Holly's disappearance, Zach, Dylan, and their friend Jason came to the Bobo house, not at all to kidnap the girl. Allegedly, they intended to teach Clint himself to make methamphetamine. Jason, who by that time had already agreed to testify against Zach in exchange for a deal with the prosecution, told even more amazing things. Allegedly, during this lesson, Holly accidentally found out what her brother was doing and was shocked and frightened. So much so that she ran out of the house screaming the same screams that the neighbors heard and which prompted them to call the police. If you believe this version, it turns out that Clint knew a lot more from the beginning than he was saying. He knew what kind of people Zach, Dylan, and Jason were and what they were capable of. That's why he was so reluctant to intervene when he realized Holly was in trouble, because he was afraid for his own skin. And then, according to Jason, this is what happened. When Holly tried to escape, the suspects grabbed her and forcibly shoved her into the car. They took her to some abandoned barn, where they took turns roughing her and then killed her, all so that she would keep quiet about their dark dealings. Of course, this is a very convenient version for Jason, which partially relieves him of responsibility. But there is one problem: Clint categorically denies that anything like that happened in their house that day. And there is no physical evidence to support Jason's words either. So why should the jury believe one criminal accusing another? Doesn't this sound like the usual rumors and slander that thugs resort to in order to save their own skin? And that's not all. If you compare Jason's testimony with what Dylan Adams told, you can see a lot of discrepancies and contradictions. It seems that each of them is telling their own version of events, and with a lot of blank spots and inconsistencies. Therefore, from everything I've heard, I can only draw one more or less reliable conclusion. Most likely, after the kidnapping, Holly was taken to the same barn that Jason mentioned, and there they did something terrible to her. And then when Zach, Dylan, and perhaps Jason himself realized that she was still alive, they decided to get rid of the witness. And Zach, as the ringleader of this gang, took on the role of executioner. He shot Holly in the back of the head, rolled her body up in a carpet, and drove it in his pickup truck to the woods near the highway. And then he threw the gun into a pond somewhere nearby so that the police would never find it. Of course, there is no direct evidence of this. There are only the words of one killer against another. But even that, it seems, was enough for the jury, because when the trial finally took place in September 2017, Zach Adams was found guilty on all counts of kidnapping, rape, and murder. For the totality of crimes, he was given life without the right to parole. His brother Dylan, who allegedly only helped cover up the tracks, got 50 years of which he will actually serve at least 35. As for Jason, who handed over his accomplices, he got off scot-free. The prosecutors dropped all charges against him supposedly. He did not take a direct part in the murder. However, I'm not sure that this is fair. After all, if even half of what these scumbags told about each other is true, then it turns out that they should all be behind bars. Every single one of them, because each of them, to one degree or another, was involved in this atrocity. But unfortunately, justice is not always perfect, and it's not always the one who committed the most serious crime who gets the most severe punishment. Sometimes those who are more guilty turn out to be more cunning than others and know how to divert suspicion from themselves in time by pointing the finger at someone else. Therefore, to be honest, I cannot say with any certainty that the final point has been put in the Holly Bobo case. There are too many dark spots and unclear moments in it, too tangled a web of lies, understatement, and mutual accusations. I do not exclude that there is something more behind all this, something that we still do not understand. These subhumans who didn't give a damn about someone else's life, who felt like having some fun and decided to play with someone else's fate like a toy. Cowards who valued their own skin above all else and therefore decided to permanently shut the mouth of the poor girl who simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes, maybe some of them managed to escape the punishment they deserved. Maybe we will never know the whole truth about those events. But one thing I know for sure: the story of Holly Bobo should not remain just one of many criminal cases. It should be a reminder for all of us, a reminder of how fragile human life is, about how easy it is to take it away and how nothing can be done later to correct what has been done. But most importantly, a reminder that evil and indifference exist alongside us. They are lurking very close behind familiar faces, and so we must always be on guard to protect those we love. Holly Bobo deserved to live a long and happy life, but it was taken from her, and although we could not save her, we have no right to forget her. Every day of my work investigating another case, I think about her and about how much more evil there is in the world that needs to be fought. The central coast of New South Wales in Australia conceals a place with a grim reputation. Snapper Point, also known as the Deadly Cliffs. Despite being a popular tourist attraction, especially among fishing enthusiasts, this location is notorious for its steep, jagged cliffs. It's not uncommon for people to fall from these slopes straight into the turbulent ocean or get swept away by sudden waves. In recent years, at least 16 tourists have lost their lives in this area. However, as practice shows, it's not always just a blind chance or the whims of nature that cause these deaths. This story is about one such case. On April 24, 2016, around 10:30 in the morning, several visiting fishermen were going about their business near Snapper Point. Suddenly, some of them, looking down from the cliffs, noticed a strange object beating against the waves. It quickly became clear that it was a body wrapped in black plastic, another victim of the treacherous Deadly Cliffs. One of the witnesses immediately reported the gruesome find to the police. Soon, a rescue helicopter arrived at the scene to retrieve the body, which was lying face down. But from the first glance, the specialist realized that this was no mere accident. The discovered body belonged to a young girl and had over 30 stab wounds. Particularly deep blows were inflicted on the neck, and there were traces on the hands and wrists indicating desperate attempts to defend herself. Unfortunately, the victim's clothing was never found, which significantly complicated the process of identifying her. The primary task for the police was to establish the identity of the deceased, and only then reconstruct the chain of events that led the girl to the medical examiner's table. But recognizing her proved to be difficult. There were no distinctive features or characteristic details of appearance. The expert determined that death occurred as a result of a brutal stabbing, and the defensive wounds on the hands indicated that the girl fought for her life until the very end. The fact that the body was found naked suggested a probable rape, but it was impossible to confirm or refute this version. The water washed away all potential evidence. To help identify the victim, law enforcement officers created a computer reconstruction of her appearance and published it online, dubbing the deceased Snapper Point Jane Doe. The girl had Asian facial features, looked to be 20 to 35 years old, was of average build, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with dark chestnut shoulder-length hair. The condition of the body suggested that it had been in the water for a relatively short time. Questioning fishermen and other potential witnesses yielded no results. No one saw anyone throw a dead girl from the cliffs into the water. The police began a large-scale check of all recently missing persons in the region, both local residents and tourists. Special attention was paid to those who might have lost contact with loved ones, friends, or girlfriends. At the same time, an active search was underway among foreigners who had recently arrived in Australia. And so, quite quickly, people responded who noticed a striking resemblance between the mysterious victim and a Chinese student who had come to Australia on an exchange 4 years ago. They immediately reported this to the police. The very next Friday after the body was discovered, the detectives working on the case were able to establish the identity of the deceased. She turned out to be 25-year-old Michelle Leng, who had gone missing at the time of her death. As it turned out, Michelle lived in the suburb of Campsie, in Sydney, about 100 kilometers from the place where her mutilated body was found. And here's a chilling coincidence. Just a year before her death, the girl took a photo on the very cliff from which her dead body was later thrown. In the picture, Michelle posed against the backdrop of water and cliffs, as if anticipating her own fate. When the media picked up this news, rumors began to spread that the girl had come to this place to meet a guy she had met online, and this date turned out to be fatal for her. Journalists spun the version that an unknown suitor literally lured Michelle to her death.
but the police promptly worked out this version and refuted it. A detailed analysis of the girl's correspondence and messengers showed that she did not meet anyone and did not plan any meetings. So who and why did someone need to cut short the life of a young student? To answer this question, investigators had to delve deeper into the details of Michelle's life and surroundings. The nature of the crime, extreme brutality, and a large number of stab wounds indicated a personal motive. The police did not abandon hope of finding the killer's trail. It was established that Michelle Leng was born in China in 1991 and had been very close to her mother, Mei Jiang, all her life. Michelle Leng's life path was full of trials from a young age. A heavy blow to the family was the death of the girl's father during a devastating earthquake that occurred in her hometown in China. This tragedy not only took the life of the closest person, but also put the family in a difficult financial situation. However, despite all the hardships, mother and daughter became even more united in the face of difficulties. Their relationship became stronger, and their emotional bond became unbreakable. Michelle acutely felt responsible for the fate of her mother and understood that without her support, they were unlikely to survive. It was then, in search of a better life and opportunities to help her family, that the girl made the decision to radically change her life. She began to consider options for moving to another country, where she could find a promising job and get a quality education. And her choice fell on distant Australia. In 2011, full of hope and expectations, Michelle Leng arrived in Sydney, the largest city on the green continent. The girl was sure that it was here, in this metropolis of opportunities, that she would be able to realize her dreams and ambitions. And at first, it seemed that fate was smiling upon her. Michelle adapted to the new realities fairly quickly, made new friends, and settled her life. She became a student at the University of Technology, Sydney, choosing economics and business as her specialty. In parallel with her studies, the girl found a job in order to be able to financially support her mother. It is worth noting that Michelle, without hesitation, sent her first salary to her mother in China. And from then on, every month she transferred money to her family, because deep in her heart, she understood how important her help was for them. In Australia, Michelle was lucky with housing. She did not have to rent an apartment, because her relatives themselves suggested that the girl should live with them in an apartment complex in the Sydney suburb of Campsie. There she lived with her 48-year-old aunt, her teenage son from a previous marriage, and her 28-year-old uncle, Derek Barrett, who was Michelle's second cousin and had been married to her aunt since 2012. For the girl's mother, this arrangement was a great relief because she knew that her daughter was under the supervision of relatives. This gave her peace of mind and confidence that nothing bad would happen to Michelle. And the girl herself enjoyed the company of close relatives. She had a warm, trusting relationship with her aunt and uncle. They seemed to Michelle to be decent, reliable people with whom one could not only share a roof over their heads, but also share the most intimate things. In addition, living with family allowed the girl to send more money to her mother, because it was possible to significantly save on housing rent. To better understand what kind of person Michelle was, investigators thoroughly studied her social media pages. There they searched for the smallest details, seemingly insignificant facts that could shed light on the identity of the deceased and, most importantly, lead to the trail of the killer. Law enforcement officers scrupulously analyzed the girl's posts, comments, likes, and photos. They checked recent calls and messages to understand who Michelle had been communicating with recently, what plans and intentions she had. This work was painstaking but extremely necessary. From the profiles on social networks, a picture emerged of a happy life of a young girl, filled with bright moments. Michelle often shared positive emotions and life-affirming thoughts with friends, loved to philosophize on topics that excited her soul. Among the publications, there were many selfies with friends against the backdrop of picturesque Australian landscapes. A special place was occupied by culinary masterpieces, which Michelle loved to show off so much. The girl adored cooking and sharing the results of her efforts on the web. It seemed that Michelle lived a tasty life in every sense of the word. Together with her friends, she often visited cafes and restaurants, tried new dishes, and studied the intricacies of local cuisine. Another passion of hers was animals, nature, and beaches. Photos from the picturesque corners of Australia appeared on the girl's pages from time to time. However, despite the richness of the newsfeed, the detectives could not find any hint of any suspicious acquaintances or dangerous connections. Then the investigators decided to talk to Michelle's closest circle, her friends and housemates. From them, it became known that the girl last got in touch on April 21st, 2016. Then she told her friends that she was planning a trip to the mall for shopping. Around noon, Michelle got on a train and went about her business. Later, the police obtained footage from surveillance cameras at the shopping center. They clearly showed the girl strolling between the rows of stores, trying things on, and buying new clothes in different departments. Her entire route through the mall was traced in detail, up to the moment when Michelle boarded the return train to Campsie. But what happened to the girl next remained a mystery. After all, there were no cameras along the way from the station to the house where Michelle lived. The last clue was that the girl logged into her media platform one more time after returning, but then her online activity stopped. Most likely, it was at that moment that something terrible happened to her. It was also strange that Michelle disappeared on Thursday, and already on Sunday, her mutilated body was found tens of kilometers from home, on the cliffs at Snapper Point. And the first to fall under suspicion were her housemates, her aunt with her husband and their son. The woman confessed to the police that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was in another city on business, so she did not even know whether Michelle had returned from shopping. But her husband, the deceased's uncle Derek Barrett, allegedly spent the whole evening at home. According to him, they had dinner together and then he went to bed. When he woke up in the morning, Michelle was already gone. The man assumed that his niece, like many girls her age, was having fun somewhere with friends, maybe even stayed overnight with someone. So at first, no one attached much importance to this. But when the girl did not show up at home on Saturday, Derek became worried. He began to write messages to Michelle, but in response, silence. The girl's mother, who was used to communicating with her daughter every day, was no less worried. Usually they talked a lot on the phone, but this time, Michelle seemed to have vanished into thin air. The aunt, returning home on Sunday, decided to look into her niece's room, and two things alerted her. Firstly, all of Michelle's things were in their places. It seemed that the girl was not going to go anywhere for a long time. And secondly, perfect cleanliness reigned in the room, as if Michelle had put things in order before something. And this was also very strange. The aunt and uncle, shocked by the suspicious circumstances of Michelle's disappearance, decided to contact the police. Their statement was received almost simultaneously with the message from the girl's friends, who actively disseminated information about her disappearance on the web. Thanks to Michelle's wide circle of acquaintances, the news of her disappearance spread like lightning across the internet and became public knowledge. The publication on the Chinese website Weibo turned out to be especially resonant. It helped to link the unidentified body found on the cliffs with the missing student. Detectives, having processed all available information about Michelle, came to the conclusion that the girl had no obvious ill-wishers. In addition, she was quite smart and savvy to stand up for herself if necessary. Cheerful and sociable, Michelle was unlikely to become a victim of a targeted murder. So the police suggested that it could have been an attack by some maniac operating in the area. However, no other similar crimes were recorded in the area. While Michelle's killer was freely roaming at large, the public was increasingly worried about their own safety and expressed dissatisfaction with the actions of law enforcement officers. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. Considering all possible versions, the investigators did not rule out racist motives. After all, the victim was an Asian girl. All students of the appropriate origin were warned about the potential danger. Until the criminal was at large, none of them could feel safe. Society demanded that the police solve the murder and arrest the suspect as soon as possible. Michelle's grief-stricken mother arrived in Australia to meet with the relatives with whom her daughter lived until her death. The woman gave several interviews to the press in which she promised to make every effort to find the dangerous criminal. She was full of determination and put a lot of pressure on the police. From her, journalists learned that Michelle's grandmother could not withstand the news of her granddaughter's death and died of a heart attack. Thus, the killer took the lives of two family members at once. First of all, the investigators thoroughly checked the alibis of Michelle's closest circle. Her aunt had reliable confirmation that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was on a business trip in a small town south of Sydney. This was evidenced by several witnesses, as well as tickets for transport and surveillance camera recordings. The woman herself was very hard going through the tragedy, blaming herself for not protecting Michelle. In her opinion, if she had not left home on that ill-fated day, then perhaps she could have prevented the disaster and saved her niece's life. The deceased's cousin, who lived with Michelle, her aunt, and his stepfather, also had an alibi. On the day of the girl's disappearance, he was engaged in everyday affairs, went to school, met with friends. Unlike Uncle Derek, the boy admitted that he did not see his sister on Thursday. Derek himself claimed that he spent the whole day at the computer. Being an IT specialist, the man supposedly worked hard on urgent projects that he had to complete by Monday. Michelle's cousin confirmed that his uncle really did not leave the computer then, but the boy could vouch for only about 3 hours spent with Derek in the apartment. Subsequently, the teenager made a shocking confession to the investigation. In general, neither Derek nor his stepson had a reliable alibi, so the police bombarded them with questions. After the first interrogation, Derek suddenly changed his testimony. It turned out that in fact, he left the house and met with some girl while his wife was away. This detail immediately attracted the attention of investigators. When asked why he did not tell about this immediately, the man referred to problems with drug addiction. Allegedly, due to the use of psychotropic substances, he has memory lapses, so he remembers the events of that day very vaguely. Such a confession sharply contrasted with the previous image of a decent family man that Derek was trying to create, and he could not provide the contacts of the girl with whom he allegedly met, so no one believed this version. Then Derek changed his testimony again. Now he stated that he was simply afraid to admit to cheating so as not to lose his wife if she found out about everything. This story seemed extremely dubious to the detectives. In addition, they noticed discrepancies in the testimony of Derek and his stepson, so the investigators' suspicions focused on the figure of Michelle's stepfather. To shed light on this dark story, the police decided to find out more about Derek Barrett and study the information from his mobile phone. By tracking the geolocation, law enforcement officers found that literally half an hour before the discovery of Michelle's body, the suspect's phone lit up 10 kilometers from Snapper Point. After reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras, investigators recorded how Derek refueled his car at a gas station near the crime scene. There, he also bought some drinks, paying with a bank card. The surveillance camera footage at the gas station clearly captured Derek Barrett, leaving no doubt about his presence in the area. So the detectives decided to ask what the suspect was doing so close to where Michelle's body was found shortly before its discovery. The man explained his presence at Snapper Point by visiting relatives. As it later turned out, Derek knew these places very well, as he was born and raised nearby. Moreover, a year ago, it was he who took Michelle to Snapper Point, where the girl even managed to take several photos against the backdrop of picturesque cliffs. However, such a coincidence seemed extremely dubious to the investigators, although they understood that it would not be easy to prove Derek's involvement in the crime. However, intuition persistently suggested to the cops that it was worth digging deeper in the direction of Barrett. So they obtained permission for a more detailed study of the contents of his mobile phone, hoping to find at least some clues that would link the suspect with the victim. And their efforts were not in vain. Thanks to special programs, experts were able to restore a lot of deleted photos and videos that shocked seasoned police officers. In many frames, Michelle was completely naked and, it seems, did not even suspect that she was being filmed secretly. The girl carelessly slept or took a shower while Derek voyeuristically recorded her on camera. But the most chilling discovery were the clips in which the unfortunate Michelle lay on the bed tied up, with a gag in her mouth. Her gaze, full of despair and pleas for salvation, left no doubt. The girl became a victim of brutal violence against her will. This evidence from Derek's phone actually confirmed his guilt in the death of his niece. The collected materials were more than enough to consider Barrett not just the main suspect, but actually Michelle's killer. So on April 30th, Derek was arrested and taken into custody. However, the man immediately began to deny any involvement in the crime. The defendant's lawyer petitioned for his client's release on bail, but the defense's argument sounded unconvincing. Derek himself, through his attorney, expressed genuine surprise at the suspicions and arrest. Despite this, his wife, the aunt of the deceased Michelle, immediately filed for divorce. The woman was stunned by what had been happening within the walls of her house right under her nose. How could she have failed to notice all these warning signs earlier? She and her son immediately cut off all relations with Derek. Investigators determined that the photos of Michelle bound and gagged were taken on the day of her disappearance. Thus, the girl simply had no chance to tell anyone about the violence she had endured. Derek had personally documented his horrific crime against his defenseless niece on his phone. Earlier recordings were also found where he abused Michelle in a somewhat milder form. The girl probably did not realize the full danger, which is why she remained silent about her uncle's perversions. The collected evidence allowed investigators to reconstruct the picture of what happened on that fateful day of April 21st, 2016. When Michelle returned home, Derek snuck into her room and forcibly made her undress. Then he tied the girl up and gagged her. Recording all of this on camera, the pervert at his victim. Soon after, Michelle's cousin, her aunt's son, returned home. The boy reported that for almost the entire time he was in the apartment, he did not see his stepfather but only heard some sounds. Apparently, water was constantly running in the shower, and Derek wasn't coming out for some reason. This seemed suspicious to the teenager, so he even became a bit worried. He approached the bathroom door and asked his stepfather if everything was all right. Hearing an affirmative response, the boy calmed down somewhat. Still, it was strange that Derek had been in the shower for almost 3 hours straight. During all this time, the man only opened the door once to ask his stepson to hand him some shampoo he had supposedly forgotten in the room. At the same time, Derek did not allow the boy to enter. Michelle's cousin sensed something was wrong but didn't dare to argue with his stepfather. At that moment, the teenager had no idea that he had narrowly missed witnessing the violence and that he could have saved his sister if he had insisted. The boy had no idea that Michelle was at home all this time. After all, judging by everything, she was tied up in her room upstairs. Shortly after her cousin left for a walk with friends, the unfortunate girl met her death at the hands of the perverted sadist. Derek managed to conceal the exact course of events and circumstances of the murder. The man claimed that due to drug use, he suffered from amnesia, so he simply didn't remember the details. It is only known that after the killing, Michelle's body ended up in the trunk of Derek's car. On April 23rd, the day after the murder, surveillance cameras on a neighboring house recorded the suspect taking out the trash from his home 4 times. Most likely, this was Derek's attempt to get rid of blood traces in the room. Then the man took the body to Sniper Point, the place where Michelle's mutilated remains were later discovered. Recordings from other surveillance cameras confirm that around 7 in the morning on April 24th, Derek's car entered the territory of Lake Manmora National Park. Just a few hours later, the girl's body was found by fishermen at the foot of the cliffs. The collected evidence was quite sufficient to prove Derek Barrett's guilt. The only chance for the defendant to avoid responsibility could have been declaring him insane. This is what the man's defense insisted on, using his claimed amnesia as an argument. However, the conclusions of the psychiatric examination were disappointing for Derek. The doctors did not find any deviations or disorders in him that could have affected his awareness of his own actions. This meant that the man was fully capable of standing trial and answering for his actions. So, after consulting with his lawyer, Derek Barrett decided to plead guilty to all charges, hoping to mitigate his sentence this way. During the trial, he tearfully apologized several times to those present, especially to his victim's mother. However, even in the dock, Derek continued to insist that drug problems had led to lapses in his memory. During the court hearing, Derek Barrett repeatedly stated that the events of that fateful day were forever etched in his memory, not allowing him to sleep peacefully at night. The man claimed that he was tormented by nightmares from which he would wake up in tears. The accused even expressed remorse for his actions, assuring that he sincerely regretted the consequences of his deeds. However, Derek continued to insist that on the day of the murder, he was under the strong influence of narcotics, which caused him to be unaware of his actions and unable to recall the details of what had happened. While in prison, he even wrote a letter to his victim's mother, May, in which he begged for forgiveness. In his message, Derek apologized 1,000 times for what he had done, assuring that he deeply regretted the crime committed. But despite all his pleas, the court found Barrett guilty of first-degree murder and a whole series of other serious crimes. The incredible cruelty and perverted nature of the sexual violence Michelle endured became aggravating circumstances in the sentencing. Consequently, Derek was sentenced to 46 years in prison. According to Australian law, he will have the right to apply for parole after serving 34 years of this term. However, the story of Michelle Leng's suffering did not end there. In 2019, a fateful event occurred that shed light on the full scale of abuse the 25-year-old student from China endured before her horrific death. It happened when Michelle's aunt came to visit her elderly mother, who lived in Strathfield, another Sydney suburb. The girl's grandmother suffered from dementia, so her daughter had to visit the sick woman often. During one of these visits, the elderly lady was tightly clutching a small object in her hands. When her daughter asked to see what she had, the woman handed her a USB flash drive. Michelle's mother wondered what it was and what information it contained. Unfortunately, the grandmother couldn't answer these questions. She thought she was holding some kind of toy, so Michelle's aunt took the flash drive with her. Upon arriving home, the woman decided out of curiosity to see what might be on it. She inserted the drive into her computer and froze in horror at seeing its contents. The aunt immediately contacted the police, handing over the terrible find to law enforcement. The flash drive contained 13 photographs and 9 videos, with a total duration of over an hour. All these materials vividly demonstrated the horrific scale of abuse that poor Michelle endured in the last hours of her life. The video showed Derek bursting into the girl's room, brutally tossing her around like a rag doll, after which he repeatedly raped her. Michelle's screams and pleas to stop the abuse seemed only to fuel her executioner's sadistic inclinations. Derek's face was frozen in a mask of perverted pleasure, and it didn't look at all like the man was under the influence of drugs, as he tried to prove in court. No, it seemed he was simply reveling in his power over the defenseless victim and deriving sick satisfaction from the very process of violence. But it still remains a mystery how the flash drive with these horrifying video evidence ended up with Michelle's grandmother. The old woman had no connection to either Derek or his victim. She lived quite far from Campsie, and she couldn't explain the origin of the USB drive herself due to progressive dementia. Eventually, the court was forced to review the charges against Derek Barrett in light of the newly discovered circumstances. He was charged with 9 additional counts related to sex crimes. This increased his prison term by 20 years to 66, and the period after which Barrett can apply for parole increased to 36.5 years. The relatives of the deceased girl insisted that her killer should be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In their opinion, the terrible cruelty and perverted nature of the crime against poor Michelle could not have any other verdict. The judge took into account the appeal of the victim's loved ones, but noted that from a legal standpoint, life imprisonment was not possible in this case. So Derek Barrett will have the right to file his first petition for parole no earlier than 2052. But even this term seems too merciful, given the suffering that Michelle and her loved ones endured at his hands. After all, The girl came from her home to distant Australia not to become prey to a pervert who turned out to be a real wolf in sheep's clothing. Michelle was simply trying to help her mother and ease the financial burden on her family by agreeing to live with relatives and save on rent. The unfortunate victim silently endured abuse for 4 long years, hoping that one day it would finally stop. Unfortunately, instead of rescue, she was met with a tragic and premature death at the hands of her sadistic uncle. The tragic story of Michelle Lang is a bitter lesson for all of us. It reminds us how important it is to be vigilant and careful, even when it seems there is no danger. For sometimes evil hides where we least expect to see it. First and foremost, this story underscores the importance of open dialogue in the family. If Michelle had felt she could safely tell someone about what was happening, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. So creating an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding between loved ones is the first step to preventing such situations. Also, this terrible story teaches us not to ignore warning signs. Perhaps if Michelle's relatives had been more attentive to changes in her behavior, they could have raised the alarm in time. So if you notice that something incomprehensible is happening with your loved ones, don't be afraid to reveal it and offer your help. Women and girls should be especially careful. Unfortunately, they most often become victims of domestic violence and perverted encroachments. So it's so important not to be silent, not to be ashamed, and not to endure abuse. If you feel something is wrong, immediately seek protection from relatives or contact law enforcement. Let Michelle's death not be in vain. Let's make her story a warning to all of us. Let's be more sensitive to our loved ones, more attentive to alarming bells, and always ready to come to the aid of those who need it. Friendship plays a crucial role in a person's life during their teenage years. However, finding a true friend with whom you can genuinely connect throughout the years is not an easy task. Sometimes those we consider close to us have selfish or even sinister intentions, and recognizing this in time is not always possible. Brittany Wylocki, the main character of our story, lived in the small town of Elko, Nevada. Her family moved here from Colorado Springs in 2010 when her father, Jim Wylocki, decided to take a job at the local mining company. The town seemed cozy and safe, perfect for living. The Wylockis were happy to start fresh, but they didn't know that soon their lives would be shattered by a terrible tragedy. The tragedy that happened to Brittany is not an isolated case. Every year, more and more teenagers become victims of violent crimes. Statistics show that the number of homicides among young people is steadily increasing. This case is not just a story about a horrible crime. It's a warning that even the closest people may turn out to be completely different from what they seem, and that our vigilance and attention to detail can save someone's life. So today I'll tell you about Brittany Wylocki, an ordinary girl whose life was cut short by an insidious crime. Brittany adored horseback riding, and there were plenty of opportunities for that here. Cattle ranching and rodeo were traditional activities and hobbies of the locals, starting from a young age. This atmosphere immediately appealed to Brittany. There was picturesque wild nature, horseback riding, and ATV riding, which the main character of the story enjoyed. Of course, all this may seem like boyish hobbies, but in these parts, they were enjoyed by both boys and girls. Such hobbies only added to the charm of the beautiful Brittany. She was very close to her brother James, as the age difference between them was just over a year. The children, close in age, got along great, constantly spending time playing together and sharing each other's interests. However, such a mood prevailed throughout the Wylocki family. They were close-knit and loving people who did not leave each other in difficult times. Even when the parents decided to divorce, the mother and father calmly settled all issues so as not to traumatize the growing generation. After that, they maintained a friendly relationship. They didn't even have problems with the division of property and custody rights. The former husband and wife reached an agreement without arguments. After the separation, Alicia moved out of her ex-husband's house, but settled nearby so that they could continue to raise their children together and not force them to make unnecessary moves. The mother and father took turns picking up their son and daughter and constantly communicated with each other. Such behavior helped to smooth out the traumatic nature of the divorce process, which inevitably affects every child. In particular, thanks to this approach, Brittany grew up to be an intelligent girl with strong moral principles and beliefs. She was very independent and not afraid of difficulties. Brittany began helping her father and mother with household chores from an early age and was entrusted with quite responsible tasks. Nevertheless, Brittany always coped excellently. By the age of 16, she had already matured enough and behaved like an adult. Brittany was great in the saddle and could herd cattle. Helping out on the ranch tempered Brittany's character and taught her a lot. She was admired by her loved ones and even neighbors who saw diligence and professionalism in her actions. At the same time, at the age of 16, Brittany remained a typical teenage girl with appropriate interests, such as experimenting with makeup and clothes. Brittany was an incredibly cheerful and friendly girl. After graduating from school, she dreamed of dedicating herself to studying psychiatry at university in order to be able to support people with mental disorders. The suffering of others always touched Brittany deeply, so it's not surprising that this activity was among her top priorities. She aspired to fulfill herself in this direction. But despite all her wonderful qualities, in 2020, Brittany faced bullying at school. Her best friend said that many people suddenly turned against the girl for no apparent reason. In her friend's opinion, the main motive for the bullying was jealousy and envy, as many girls envied Brittany's beauty and intelligence. As a result, Brittany had to switch to homeschooling. But she did not despair. Thanks to social networks, Brittany found a small circle of close people who sincerely loved and supported her. Brittany devoted even more time to her passion, horse racing, where she met like-minded people. It was there that she met Bryce Dickey, who was a few years older than her. They quickly got along and became friends. Brittany always spoke of him as an older brother, although it seems the guy wanted more. He constantly spent time with his friend, and Brittany herself got along well with his family. But despite this, their relationship remained purely friendly. Bryce was described as a polite and pleasant young man who, just like Brittany, was always ready to help those in need. The similarity of characters brought these two together. On March 8, 2020, the friends agreed to meet to spend time together as they often did. On the same day, Brittany's father, who played in a rock band, had a rehearsal. Brittany gladly joined him before meeting Bryce. She was in a great mood, cheerfully chatting with all the musicians. Brittany even invited Bryce to watch their performance, but the guy was late and missed the rehearsal. Bryce planned to pick up his friend in his car so they could watch a movie at his place, and then promised to take her back. It was assumed that Brittany's father would return around 7:30, and by that time, Brittany should have been waiting for him at home. When her father returned at the appointed time, it turned out that his daughter was not home yet. The man walked through the whole house calling Brittany by name, but there was no answer. He began to worry and tried to call her, but her number was turned off. This seemed extremely strange, because usually responsible Brittany always warned if her phone was about to die. She was never late, and even if she wasn't going to make it, she would definitely inform her family. The assumption that Brittany could have simply forgotten about the arrangement or lost track of time and not noticed that the evening had come sounded absolutely implausible. The worried father turned to his son, but he also had no idea where his sister might be. Then the man contacted the last person with whom Brittany was supposed to spend time that day, Bryce. The guy said that after a few hours spent in the city, he dropped his friend off at the school, where she met some young man unknown to him. After that, Bryce left so as not to interfere with their conversation. Brittany's father was surprised why they didn't watch the movie as they had originally planned. Bryce claimed that he and Brittany had simply changed their plans and decided to take a ride out of town. The father of the missing girl, of course, was interested in who she met, but Bryce did not know him personally. According to his description, it was a tall, light-skinned young man who looked like a cowboy. This information surprised the girl's father. It was unclear who the stranger was and why Bryce left his friend with him instead of giving her a ride home, as they had previously agreed. This was not at all like Bryce, who always cared about Brittany, and here he just left her with some guy and drove away. A strange situation. Immediately after talking with Brittany's father, Bryce wrote to her brother. He seemed to be very worried about what had happened and felt guilty for not taking his friend home. He said she herself asked to be left. But now Bryce realized the seriousness of the situation and feared that something might have happened to her. The only thing the guy remembered was the stranger's old Ford F-150 pickup truck, which he described as an unpleasant color. This detail only heightened the anxiety of the relatives because none of their acquaintances drove such a vehicle. Brittany's entire family did not sleep that night, dialing her number hundreds of times, but the calls were constantly redirected to voicemail. In addition, the father and brother patrolled the streets in a car, driving around the school and the entire city, hoping to find the missing girl. They called her friends and acquaintances. Finally, one of the friends recalled that shortly before the disappearance, Brittany had mentioned some guy named JT. She did not describe any details of their communication, but it seemed that Brittany was going to meet with him. This lead seemed very important for the investigation. The worried parents then turned to the police, but they initially assumed that the teenager might have simply run away from home or was hanging out with friends and would return soon. But the family knew it wasn't like Brittany. She had few friends and none of them knew where she was. The girl had never had problems with behavior or family. No addictions, mental disorders, or conflicts. No reason to run away. Her loved ones understood that such a disappearance concealed something bad. Eventually, the sheriff was convinced to take the case seriously. He was given all the information that could be gathered from Brittany's friends and acquaintances. Then the police decided to question Bryce and arranged a meeting near the school so that he could describe in detail what happened when he dropped the girl off. Bryce said that they were driving around the Spring Creek area as usual. Suddenly, his father called and asked him to come home urgently to help with some errands. Brittany agreed to postpone the ride, only asking to be dropped off at the school. She admitted that she wanted to meet her new acquaintance, JT. Bryce saw her heading towards a green pickup truck where a white guy in a cowboy hat was sitting, but he just drove away without even making sure if she got into the car. Bryce poorly remembered the details and didn't even pay attention to the pickup truck's license plate. The detectives did not suspect him of lying and decided to let him go, focusing on other areas of the search. The investigation decided to draw public attention through the media, hoping that someone might have noticed the guy in the cowboy hat and his green pickup truck. The police especially hoped to find out the vehicle's number, but the locals were in no hurry to share information. The sheriff turned to the telephone company to determine the last location of Brittany's cell phone. It turned out that her phone had last registered activity 7 kilometers from the school where Bryce had dropped her off. Law enforcement immediately went to this address, hoping to find new leads. However, a thorough inspection of the area yielded no results. Brittany's family and friends tirelessly patrolled the streets, posting flyers with her photo. More than 500 announcements were distributed throughout the city and its surroundings, but the locals stubbornly remained silent. No one was in a hurry to assist the investigation. It seemed that Brittany had vanished into thin air. The mother of the missing girl even created a group on social networks where she constantly posted up-to-date information about the search progress. But even this did not yield results. Suddenly, she received a message from an unknown number. The anonymous person claimed to have kidnapped Brittany and demanded a ransom of $25,000, threatening to feed her to the dogs if the demands were not met. Later, he wrote again, informing them that Brittany was sick and could die without medicine. The criminal insisted that the captive would receive medications only if he was paid the specified amount. At first, the parents were ready to agree to this, but they decided to turn to the police first. Brittany's mother called the police station and told them about the situation. She was immediately invited to come so they could try to track the extortionist's number. It seemed that the investigation had a valuable lead. While the officers were trying to establish the owner of the number, the head of one of the search teams contacted the police station. He reported that volunteers were combing the area 20 kilometers from the city and suddenly noticed a puddle on the side of the road that looked like dried blood. The team got out of their vehicles and began to examine the territory. 100 meters from the road, in the bushes, they found a blue tarp under which lay the body of a girl. She was face down, partially undressed. The description of the clothes matched what Brittany was wearing on the day of her disappearance, but it was necessary to officially identify the deceased before informing the family. Right during the conversation with the missing girl's mother, a detective entered the office and said that the conversation would have to be postponed due to the urgent need to go to the place where the body was found. The woman burst into tears, feeling in her heart that it was her little girl who had been found. Unfortunately, the mother's intuition did not fail her. She recognized Brittany. A few meters from the body, forensic experts found a keychain with her name, which was later identified as the victim's property. The girl had clearly been coerced into intimacy. Her pants and underwear were pulled down to her ankles. She had been strangled and her throat was slashed. This was the cause of death. On the nearest bushes, officers noticed the victim's headphones, which were hanging from the wires caught on the branches. A used condom was also found here, and its packaging was lying next to the body. Now there was more than enough material to search for the criminal. The investigators were most interested in the new acquaintance, JT, about whom most people from the victim's circle had heard, but no one could say anything specific about him. Investigators were looking for this guy. The news of the murder shook the entire town. Almost all of its inhabitants knew each other by sight, so such a terrible crime could not but resonate in people's hearts. Particularly strong support for the Wilaki family came through social networks. Bryce stood out the most as he had been in close communication with the victim's mother, father, and brother the whole time. He helped the family, cried, and said that he would never forget this bright person who had become a close friend to him. The detective's work was just beginning. It was necessary to obtain warrants to examine the girl's computer and cell phone. In addition, it was necessary to analyze the discovered evidence, including the DNA from the condom, the main key to the puzzle. It was assumed that Brittany could have been the victim of an internet predator with a propensity for sexual violence. Just in case, a list of registered sex offenders in the area who could be involved in the tragedy was quickly compiled and checked. All this needed to be compared in order to track down the criminal, but these processes take a lot of time, so the investigation dragged on. In parallel, the information from the kidnapper was being checked. The police quickly managed to establish the phone number from which the victim's mother had been called with ransom demands. Unfortunately, it was not registered in Nevada. It turned out to be a hidden number purchased on the internet, so it was not possible to track the data. However, the very fact of such messages spoke volumes. In the life of the Wilaki family, there was clearly a person who took pleasure in such bullying and wanted to profit from this tragic case. According to the detectives, the one who used it was most likely connected with Brittany's death. Of course, first of all, the investigators wanted to understand who JT was. It was believed that this young man was the most likely criminal. Having obtained data from the murdered girl's phone, law enforcement quickly tracked down the mysterious man. However, the detectives' disappointment knew no bounds. It turned out that at the time of Brittany's death, JT was in Alaska. They had met shortly before the events described. Indeed, Brittany and JT were going to meet, but he clearly could not be the one who used and killed her by slashing her throat. The guy had not left Alaska during that period, so it was a false lead. Investigators decided to check other guys and men with the same initials driving similar vehicles who lived in the city, its surroundings, and near the place where the body was found. The detectives managed to find only two. Both were young ranch workers driving green pickup trucks, but at the time of the murder they were too far away and had reliable alibis. The investigation had reached a dead end, so they decided to contact the family of the deceased again, hoping that some information might have been missed. Brittany's mother said that a few weeks before her daughter's death, she had been dating a guy close to the cowboy lifestyle. He lived on a ranch and was engaged in rodeo, but they quickly broke up due to the girl's refusal of intimacy. Despite maintaining a friendly relationship, the breakup was caused by several unpleasant quarrels during which he wished Brittany dead. However, after checking, this man also had a confirmed alibi.
it seemed that the investigation was reaching another dead end. The last way to calculate the probable rapist and murderer remained: to review all the recordings from surveillance cameras in the city that could have captured a green pickup truck with a cowboy at the wheel. Fortunately, in the direction Brittany was moving before her death, calmly sitting in her killer's car, there were several high-quality cameras. They provided a clear picture, but ahead lay dozens of hours of video footage. No matter how much time the investigators spent viewing it, they could not detect the vehicle Bryce had described. There was no green pickup truck. The strangest thing was that it did not appear on the surveillance cameras near the school where her friend had supposedly dropped the girl off. However, the police managed to notice something else, no less attractive to attention. The blue Chevy pickup truck that Bryce himself drove did indeed end up on the recording, but the guy did not stop or drop anyone off. He simply drove past the school without stopping. So, he had lied about the green pickup truck. The detectives then decided to trace the direction of his vehicle's movement. The young man had previously admitted that he had been driving around the area with his friend for several hours, but this also turned out to be untrue, given the results of watching the video cameras. They decided to request Bryce's cell phone data to compare his geolocation with the location of the attack victim. The detectives managed to quickly obtain a warrant to access this information, given the reasonableness of the suspicions. The young man was not informed about anything, fearing that they would spook the new suspect. It was obvious that he had been next to Brittany the entire day. Their movement trajectories completely coincided, right up to the moment her mobile phone was turned off. Moreover, he had clearly been at the place where the deceased's body was found, and then went home. It became clear that the friend had been at the crime scene and had either killed the girl himself or witnessed the massacre. To confirm the assumption, it was necessary to conduct an examination. The guy was immediately asked to take tests and provide DNA samples. He agreed and submitted the materials, but for the time being, they were forced to let him go. The investigators did not tell him about their suspicions. On the contrary, they pretended that everything was fine. They said they were taking samples from everyone in the missing girl's circle to exclude them from the list of suspects. Skin particles were also found under the victim's nails. All these materials eventually matched Bryce's DNA samples. There was no doubt that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with Brittany, but everything had happened involuntarily. Brittany had been forced into this. Finally, Bryce was invited for questioning once again, without revealing their true intentions and the information that was already known to the investigation at that time. The young man agreed without resistance. As before, he behaved calmly and confidently. The detectives tried to find out if he had ever had a relationship with Brittany, particularly a sexual one, but he denied any such arguments. According to him, the guy considered the girl more of a sister than a possible partner. After that, the investigators gradually began to lead the main suspect to the exposure of the lie. Obviously, if Bryce was telling the truth, no traces of his DNA would have been found. But the investigator reported that a condom with his seminal fluid was found at the murder scene. Perhaps realizing what the detective was hinting at, the young man changed his testimony. He began to claim that Brittany had indeed flirted with him that day, which she had never done before. The story continued to transform. The guy said that they started kissing, then, by mutual agreement, engaged in oral sex with a condom. According to the suspect's story, this happened on the side of the road, where the body was later found. According to the young man, after intimacy, he still took her to meet another guy, but changed the address, informing them that they did not get out in the school area. Bryce continued to stick to the version with the guy in the green pickup truck, insisting that he did not see the cowboy properly, so he could not describe him in detail or name the car's number. The investigators summed it up. From Bryce's words, it followed that after the other guy picked up Brittany, they, for some reason, went to the same place where the used condom was thrown away, and the body was later found. There, the stranger killed the girl. Of course, it all sounded absurd, especially given that no foreign DNA was found on the murdered girl's body. But there were plenty of Bryce's traces.
They were found under the nails, in intimate places, and even on the neck in the area of the knife wound that doomed the girl to death. In addition, given Bryce's movement trajectory and surveillance camera footage, it was confirmed that the guy did not stop anywhere else, so this was another of his lies. The suspect was informed about all these discrepancies. Under the pressure of the investigators, the young man broke down and finally confessed that he had killed Brittany, but called what happened an accident. The suspect insisted that she wanted rough sex with a knife and, in a fit of passion, impaled herself on the blade. It sounded completely implausible, given his constant lying. Finally, 18-year-old Bryce was arrested. This happened on March 19, 2020, and then searches were conducted in his house and car. After obtaining a warrant, the detectives came to Bryce's home. In the guy's closet, they found a pair of bloody shoes with traces of the victim, as well as a knife that was the probable murder weapon. A bloody hoodie was found in the trunk of the car. All of this contained the victim's blood, as well as numerous fingerprints and DNA samples from Bryce. After the family of the deceased was told who the killer really was, they were in complete shock. Brittany's mother, father, and brother considered Bryce a decent young man, their daughter's best friend, and treated him like a son. The victim's relatives would never have believed that he had done it if there hadn't been such a large amount of incriminating evidence against the guy. The family trusted this person like a relative, and he simply took advantage of this with the most insidious purpose. The hearings began only 2 years later, in May 2022. On the prosecution side, there were many convincing witnesses, among whom was Bryce's ex-girlfriend. She told them who the ex-boyfriend really was, and this picture was strikingly different from most people's ideas about the defendant. The townspeople considered him a real cowboy and an exemplary guy, ready to help in a difficult moment. In reality, it was all just a mask. As you know, Brittany's family trusted the killer because he looked after the girl in a brotherly way. He controlled her so that she would come home on time, carefully gave her rides, which seemed very cute. In fact, this was not done with the best intentions. He simply wanted to know everything about his future victim, as manipulators do. According to the defendant's ex-girlfriend, Bryce could sometimes be very aggressive and cruel. He constantly provoked quarrels and strangled her at least 4 times during conflicts. The last time it was so serious that Brittany had already said goodbye to life. Fortunately, he did not cross the line. After she broke up with Bryce, the guy stalked and threatened her for a long time until the victim's parents began to threaten to contact law enforcement. The jury did not need to be convinced of the criminal's guilt for long, given the obvious evidence, but the lawyer fiercely defended his client, voicing the most absurd assumptions. After 9 days of hearings, it took the jurors about an hour to discuss the verdict. All the jurors agreed that Bryce was guilty of first-degree murder and coercion into intimate relations. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a 20-year term. For the use of a deadly weapon, he received another 20 years. The same for abduction, and for coercion into intimacy by force, another 10 years were added to the sentence. Bryce went behind bars for life. He will be able to go free only after 70 years in prison. Most likely, Bryce will never be released. To the great regret of Brittany's family, Bryce never reported the motive for the crime. It remained a mystery what could have provoked his aggression. However, the veil of secrecy was lifted by the deceased's friend. Brittany knew that a few days before the murder, Bryce had confessed his love to Brittany, but she did not reciprocate, suggesting that they remain friends. The detective suggested that the guy could not survive the rejection and harbored a grudge against her. And when he found out that she was communicating with a new guy named JT, he went off the rails, decided to teach his victim a lesson, and take revenge on her. The tragic story of Brittany Wlocki is not only a story about a brutal crime, but also a warning for each of us. This Brittany became a victim of a person she unreservedly trusted, her best friend, Bryce. It was blind trust and the inability to see a person's true face behind the mask of benevolence that led to this tragedy. Brittany, like her family, considered Bryce a wonderful guy, almost a family member. His care and willingness to help seemed like genuine manifestations of friendship, but in reality, manipulation and insidious intentions were hidden behind this. Bryce wanted to control the girl's every move, to know about all her actions and connections. And when Brittany refused him in response to a declaration of love and became interested in another, Bryce decided to take brutal revenge. This story teaches us to be more careful in relationships, not to trust people blindly even if they seem to be the best of friends. It is worth paying attention to alarming bells, to incomprehensible or suspicious actions, to manifestations of aggression and excessive control. One cannot underestimate the danger and risks even when they seem unlikely. At the same time, the tragedy could have been avoided, or the crime could have been solved faster if law enforcement had acted more promptly and attentively. Initially, the police did not take the girl's disappearance too seriously, assuming that she could have run away from home or hung out with friends. If the investigation had started immediately, perhaps Brittany could have been saved. In addition, the girl's family and friends believed Bryce's words for too long, although there were many inconsistencies and contradictions in his story. If they had suspected something wrong earlier and shared their doubts with the investigation, it could have expedited the disclosure of the crime and the arrest of the killer.